Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Izuku lost his sight to unlock his quirk's power. Here is short summary. Midoriya Izuku is a boy different from all the rest. Point 1. He prefers learning over playing. Point 2. He barely shows his emotions. Point 3. His quirk is turning him blind. After a car crash results in the death of both his parents and renders him completely blind before he was supposed to be, Izuku's dream of heroism is cut short, or so everyone thinks. Left with a foster family who actually love him, a sister as sarcastic as he is in a powerful elemental quirk, Izuku must brave the world, and dangers lurking below society's light to fight for a place in heroism. And if, along the way, he discovers friends, a new family and love on the way, Izuku will handle it with a snappy wit, his powerful quirk and his sightless eyes. Whoever said a blind boy couldn't become a hero? Izuku doesn't need his sight to see. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Anyone who'd met Midoriya Izuku would have said the same thing. He's a quiet boy, shy, doesn't like attention, his daycare teacher said. The nerd hates when we play even a little rough, he's a wuss and a baby, Bakugo Katsuki said. He's a sweet little boy, kind and always willing to help out in the neighborhood. He doesn't speak a lot, nor does he show any signs of other communications. Many of the children believe he's dumb. I believe he's only ignoring them to get them to stay away from him. He seems to love animals. He's always got at least one mangy cat or flea-ridden mutt hanging around him, the elderly on his street said. All in all, Midoriya Izuku was a normal 4-year-old, a shy 4-year-old, but a normal boy nonetheless. There was no acting out of sorts when he didn't get his way, no tantrums or demands, but acceptance and compromise, and many around him agreed he was smart, very smart, for his age. His mother, Inko, agreed, and his father, Hisashi, never backed down from her assessment of their child. In fact, the only thing that struck the parents, friends, neighbors and daycare teachers as odd, was the fact that Midoriya Izuku, 4 years of age, was slowly, but surely, going blind. It was never fun for a parent to realize that their child would never see anything again past the age of 6, and the news of the hidden growth of a quirk factor appearing in their son didn't help the Midoriya family's distraught tears. Izuku himself was as calm as the eye of a storm, no sign of the Midoriya tears anywhere. Inko was bawling her eyes out in the doctor's office in the uncomfortable plastic chairs with white walls wrapping around her and her husband. He sat next to her, trying to console the woman while the doctor sat back in his chair behind his desk, visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, please, dry your tears," the man tried, only for Inko to turn a glare on him. "My son's going blind and you think gaining a quirk is enough to let that go? My baby's never going to see us again," she wailed, Hisashi glaring at the doctor in her stead as she hid her face in her hands. No, you didn't let me finish. Your son's quirk, ma'am, is a powerful emitter quirk, and with the factors we've been seeing, it's some sort of sensory quirk. However, this one is difficult to figure out, to say the least. Not only is it a sensory quirk, it's an emitter type that seems to also pursue a mutant variant in his brain, altering some of the neurons that allow him sight. While we believe this may be the cause of his blindness, it could also be said that this might be some form of preparation your son's body is instinctually undergoing to gain more and better control over his quirk. The interesting thing, the most fascinating part of this entire situation, is that your son's quirk also appears to have all the set parameters of an elemental quirk. The doctor babbled, his excitement growing with every word. Inko and Hisashi tried hard to keep up with the man, but hearing what he had to say seemed to root fear firmly inside of Inko. Elemental quirks were powerful and were often emitter quirks, but with an added mutation aspect that was draining Izuku of his sight for a sensory quirk. That did no favors for the poor woman. Hisashi himself wasn't his son's biggest fan, with his quiet stoicness, his inability to smile unless around animals, how often Izuku was out and about with no form of footwear or protection, and the amount of time the boy spent reading books and ignoring social interaction with kids his age. It wasn't right, not in his eyes. But Izuku was still his son, and to hear the boy would never see again, that wasn't fair. He'd never know the unnameable true blue of the sky, he'd never get to see the clearness of waters or all the bright flowers that seemed to grow everywhere, and the doctor thought the boy finally getting a quirk was a good thing. No, Hisashi shook his head. We don't care if he has a quirk or not, he finally yelled, the startled doctor jumping in his chair and shutting off his rambling. Our son is losing his sight so it can be replaced with some sensory quirk, and you want us to celebrate? He could barely hide his disgust. The doctor floundered for a response, gaping like a fish, and his arms moved about frantically in the air until he deflated at last. I can't help it. Quirks are my passion, and your son is about to gain one of the most powerful elemental quirks I've seen since Endeavor, and for once it's not a fire or water type elemental. The doctor whined. Both parents stilled at that. You mean to say my boy might have an earth or wind quirk? Inko asked quietly. Why, yes, ma'am, that's what the results show. The quirk won't come in until he's fully blind, though, he warned, his voice subdued. Inko let out another strangled sob, and Hisashi was quick to embrace her in a hug, his eyes wide. Out of all elemental quirks, the 4 cardinal elements and other sub-elements, water, fire and lightning were common, and ice was just an extent of water. They were never presented in the same way, but they were, by far, the most seen by quirk doctors. Wind wasn't as common, but other quirks such as telekinesis actually stemmed from a small, base wind quirk. Healing often counted as an element in most fantasy manga and light novels, and though it was rare to find one, straight earth manipulation quirks were rarer. Sure, plant manipulation and growth quirks were all over the place, but to find a quirk who could manipulate the earth straight from the ground and manipulate it outright was almost unheard of. And you're sure he has to go blind for this to happen? Hisashi asked hoarsely. Yes, sir. As I told you, his body, as it is not yet ready for a quirk as powerful as his will be. It has to take something away to be able to fit perfectly into his body, to be compatible with it. The sensory part of the quirk most likely stems from that. It needed more space, and the eyes were the things it chose to replace, forcing the quirk to develop a way to not burden its owner with the loss. This is what first led us to suspecting a wind or earth quirk, because of the sensory aspect. Air currents, wind, molecules, all of these could be used to see around him. We also believe it could be an earth element quirk, but it is unlikely. Anyway, his newborn quirk is forcing young Midoriya-san to go blind, but his body is fighting back, which is why, when he goes blind at 6 or 7, he probably won't get his quirk until he's 7 or 8. During the period of loss of eyesight, gainment of a quirk and adjustment, the safest way to school him would be through the online system. Once quirk control is adequate, we then recommend re-enrolling Midoriya-san back into school, the doctor replied. He went on to discuss the process of blindness and how to support and help Izuku once he was fully blind. Braille books were thrust onto the parents, as well as pamphlets for schools for the disabled, and anything else that might be of benefit to Izuku after his sight was gone. Little Izuku himself stood to the side, unnoticed and practically forgotten. He watched his parents discuss all the ways that Izuku might need help because he'd be weak and helpless with the loss of his sight. Even at 4 years of age, Izuku liked to believe he had a good handle on his emotions. He never cried or threw fits when he didn't get his way. He wasn't overly excited or terrified over things that would excite or scare other kids his age. He kept a neutral, blank face on at all times, but the scene before him made him want to scowl. Why are you talking like I'm dying? I'm only losing my sight, and even then, it won't all be lost. He spoke softly, but even that was enough to halt the flurry of actions going on in the small doctor's office. The adults glanced at him, his mother and father in slight guilt for forgetting he was there, and the doctor himself in shock. Hush, Izuku, baby. The adults are speaking. Now, you must be careful at all times, okay baby? Now that we know what's going on, you can't play rough with your friends, okay? We'll make sure you stay safe, honey, Inko told him, crouching down to match his level. I'll be fine, Mom, it's only my sight. I'll get it back with my quirk. Maybe not with color, but I'll get it back, he persisted. Inko sighed, wrapping Izuku in a tight hug. Oh baby, You'll be okay, it's alright to cry. This is a painful time for us, but don't you worry, Mom and Dad will take care of you, she sniffled. Izuku withheld a sigh and turned to the doctor instead. With my quirk, could I still be a hero? The temperature in the room fell flat. The doctor, who'd positively lit up in the question, began to nod enthusiastically at him, while both his parents regarded him with horror in their eyes. Izuku, I know being a hero is your dream, but being blind is a big handicap you can't get over with a sensory quirk. You're at a disadvantage already, even without a quirk, but if what the doctor said was true, you're going to be a late bloomer, another disadvantage. Izuku, you'll be playing catch-up with the other kids who've already gotten their quirks. It's best you give up, bud, his father explained gently. Now instead of annoyance, Izuku wanted to be angry. He could hear his mother sobbing and his father trying to explain why he couldn't be a hero, but the doctor was upset, he saw. He glanced subtly at the man, who locked eyes with Izuku. The doctor nodded, once, and mouthed, "You'll be a great hero." And that was all Izuku needed. He would be blind, he'd be a late bloomer, but he was going to be a hero, even if he had to fight the world to do so. When the family returned home, Inko and Hisashi began to implement the procedures the doctor had instructed them on. He wasn't due to start elementary until he turned 7, so he was allowed to stay in daycare, but he was to be pulled away from the other children, isolated because of his disability. Instead of playing with his friends, he was to learn Braille and how to take care of himself. He wouldn't be allowed outside for fear of sunburn or injury, and he was given stricter rules to follow. He wasn't allowed to stay out, and he certainly wasn't allowed on excursions and detours from home. Although he nodded along and agreed to everything with his usual blank face, inside he balked at the restrictions he was placed under by his parents. Why did they think he was weak and fragile? Why did they think he had to be protected? Nevertheless, he sat through the fussing, bearing the numerous insinuations of, "You're blind, therefore you're weak," until his parents were satisfied and allowed him to leave. He shut himself in his room, wondering if freedom would ever be his. He glanced at his analysis notebook, the one he'd started a couple weeks ago, realizing he'd have to fight to keep his hobby going. He lay back on his bed, sighing quietly to himself. He could already tell his eyesight was leaving him. It was getting harder and harder to see every day, and in only a couple of years, it would be gone entirely. He didn't really mind much. Sight was just another tool in a toolbox, all the senses were. If he was deprived of one, he'd make up for it with the others. Learning how to read Braille was one of the only sensible outcomes that came from his parents. He knew they were trying to keep him safe, but stifling him and coddling him in blankets wasn't helping him. If anything, their overprotection of him would only lead to bullying, not that Kachan ever needed a reason to. "He thinks he's so amazing just because he got his quirk early," Izuku mumbled into his pillow. His old friend had always been confident, but arrogance was starting to settle in now that he got his quirk. Once everyone started praising the boy, he was becoming insufferable, and none of the adults were bothering to correct his increasingly violent tendencies. Izuku could feel a new emotion bubbling up inside of him. His own quirk, his very own superpower, and it was a rare elemental quirk. Fire and water quirks were everywhere. They were as common as quirk came, even if they all varied in some form or fashion. Wind and earth quirks too, but straight wind and straight earth quirks were a little harder to find than a quirk that used the elements, like a plant growth quirk or a quirk that manipulated the air. A little bubble of hope began to inflate inside of Izuku. Sure, his sight was leaving him, but when his quirk was going to be awesome, did he really care? Not really. He couldn't rely on just his quirk if he wanted to be a hero, though. So he was going to have a strong quirk. Yay for him, what else could he do? His analysis notebook was a good start, but what else could give him an edge that his mother and father would actually let him do? Parkour was out, gymnastics was a maybe, for flexibility. They might let him take up an instrument, but he couldn't decide on a single one. Dance was something that interested him, and art. Anything technological was pretty much out, though he wanted to give hacking and coding a try. Izuku frowned, jumping up from his bed and marching to the desk in his room, writing down a list of things he wanted to try that would be deemed safe for his disability. Once he'd finished, he left his room and approached his parents in the living room, sifting through the pamphlets they'd received from the doctor. "Mom, Dad, could I ask you something?" he called quietly. Both of them looked up, questions on their faces. I know that with my eyes I can't do a lot of the things other kids can, and I know you worry a lot about my activities now that I won't have my sight, but I thought these might be safe enough for even someone like me to do. I'm interested in all of them and I was hoping you'd let me," he explained quietly, handing over the list to his mother. His father craned over to examine the list as Izuku kept going. "I made sure to look at all of them, and most of the basic classes don't have anything any more difficult or straining than simple stretches and endurance, and I won't be learning anything intense until I can do all the simple things perfectly. It would mean a lot if I could at least give them a go," he finished. "Izuku, a lot of these things require sight. Are you sure you want to start?" Hisashi naked him seriously. "There's nothing here that we wouldn't approve of," Inko began with a frown. "If you really want to put in the work, then Hisashi and I will sign you up for classes. You have to promise us, baby, that you won't start anything too advanced. You need to be careful. If you get even a little injured, if we hear of any complaints, we will pull you from the classes. We'll start you off with dance, coding and music. If you're satisfied with those and you can keep them up after you become blind, Hisashi and I will think about gymnastics lessons. Got it, Izuku?" The boy nodded to his parents carefully, giving them a small, simple smile with gratitude. "Yes, Mom, thank you. I promise I'll take care of myself," he nodded, taking back the list and returning to his room. Hisashi turned to Inko after he'd left, a frown marring his otherwise handsome face. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Inko?" he asked in hushed tones. "What else can we do, Hisashi? We're coddling him as it is." Hisashi snorted with amusement. "He doesn't like that at all, does he? As trying to wrap him in wool." Inko shook her head. "Of course he wouldn't. We're treating him as if he couldn't do a single thing after his eyes stop functioning. He knows we don't approve of his dream even more than we used to, now that he's going blind. This is his way of telling us that he'll be fine, that he can do everything other kids can do. He wants us to treat him like a normal kid. But he's not normal, Inko. Our boy's going blind because of his quirk. He won't be able to do half the things the other kids can. You know the neighbors talk, how strange they think our Izuku is already. What about when they find out about Izuku's condition? The kids won't let him rest. Hisashi, our Izuku's a smart, talented boy. We're absolutely terrified for him, the discrimination he'll face once people find out about his eyes, but the doctor was certain his quirk had a sensory aspect. He was certain it would be a strong one, too. So we can only thank our lucky stars and pray that he'll find a new dream, one that doesn't involve heroics. So we protect him from people, but allow him to put himself in danger in the form of activities like these." Hisashi growled, gesturing towards Izuku's list. "I'm against this, Inko. We're just lucky I'll be around after my work agreed to let me be with you and Izuku after they heard about his predicament. They're giving me 5 years with you until I leave for America. I'm not wasting that time watching him stumble around these classes blind. If you think he can do it, okay, I'm with you, but the second he falters or falls behind because he can't see, we're pulling him from classes until his quirk," Hisashi scoffed at this, "gives him his sight back. Happy?" he asked his wife grumpily. Inko nodded with a loving smile and Hisashi sighed as she pulled him in for a kiss. "Thank you, Hisashi. Let's keep our little boy safe," Inko whispered. "I love you, Coco, you know that. I'm just worried about our boy. He'll be at a disadvantage his whole life and he still wants to follow an impossible dream. All we can really do is try to make him see reality," Inko replied. "So we enroll him in classes and when he can't keep up, we pull him for his own good, alright, if that's the plan. The doctor said his quirk would be strong, and that it would come in about a year after he's fully blind. We can use that to make him give up, Hisashi. Izuku will realize his dream is unattainable once he can't do anything. Now come on, these schooling pamphlets won't sort themselves," Inko chucked. As the two parents turned back to the pile on the table, Izuku, his ear pressed to the door of his room, glared at the floor. They weren't letting him do what he wanted because they believed in him. they thought they could get him to give up on his dream after he failed. They had no trust in him at all. Why couldn't they just believe in him? Why couldn't they just let him follow his dream? Why couldn't they just trust he could do it? Izuku clenched his fists, moving away from the door. If they won't believe in me, fine, I'll just have to believe in myself. If you refuse to think I'm taking these classes because they can help, just keep your opinions to yourself and I'll prove you and everyone else who thinks my dream is stupid wrong. If I can't even trust my own parents to support me, I might as well not trust a soul, he muttered to himself. And it was that thought that got Izuku thinking. His parents put on a face, and act around him and never let their true thoughts show. His best friend turned into a hot-headed, arrogant bully with the manifestation of his quirk. The other kids flocked around whoever was strongest. The teachers and adults brushed all other complaints aside because of strong, heroic quirks. There was no one he could actually, totally trust, no one who would ever believe him and give him the benefit of the doubt, no one who'd treat him normally and not some blind freak show with a good quirk. As long as he kept putting trust and faith into people who wouldn't reciprocate or show him that he could, he was simply setting himself up to be let down. There's absolutely no one I can trust, is there? Not really. So I just won't. I don't really play with any of the kids anyway. If they want a blind freak show, that's what they'll get. Izuku grinned as an idea flooded his mind. He rushed to his drawers, rifling through them and making a mess until he found a strip of solid black cloth he could only just see through. He put it up to his eyes and wrapped it around his eyes. It was a perfect fit. His grin widened. This should work, now I just need to get used to it. If I'm going to go blind eventually, might as well start practicing now, he snickered, tying the cloth around his eyes. Once he finished and started to take a good look around him, he realized that it would be harder than he thought. Everything was black, it enclosed his eyes, trapped them in darkness, leaving him only a haze of object outlines, if even that. He tried to make his way back to his bed, stumbling around toys and crayons that had fallen on the floor that he decided to pick up later. Now I know the benefit of having a tidy room, at least, he grumbled to himself. It wasn't a long walk, several steps honestly, yet Izuku still found himself face-planting into his carpet when he misstepped and slid on a missed pencil. He wondered if spending a year blind and without his quirk would be as bad as his attempt now, but if he could manage himself with nothing at all, mastering his quirk, the sensory aspect of it at least, would be a cinch. He kept going, trying to weave himself around his room blindfolded, but by his fifth fall he started to get frustrated. Never mind, a 4-year-old shouldn't be trying exercises without his sight. He hated the fact he couldn't get around his own room with his sight. Izuku scrambled to his feet excitedly. That's what he was doing wrong. Even though it wasn't much, he could still see and was relying on the few outlines he could see instead of focusing on his other senses. Izuku took a breath, closing his eyes even with the blindfold on, allowing his hearing, smell and touch to guide him, slowly walking around his room. It took a few tries, but finally, Izuku started to understand. There wasn't a lot of noise to rely on, not a lot of things to touch, either, but with every step he took it was like something around him keyed him into all the little things around him, the crayons, toys, papers and clothes around him, until he could navigate his room with barely a thought, the blindfold wrapped tightly around his eyes forgotten. Izuku, sweetie, it's time for dinner, his mother called. Izuku's neck swiveled around to the door, his body turning with him. He opened the door to face his mother. I'm coming, he said calmly, even as she gasped and jolted in surprise. Izuku, what are you doing with that thing around your eyes? She cried, his father perking up from where he stood finished up dinner in the kitchen. He snorted when he saw his son, sniggering with delight. That's one way to prepare for blindness, Hisashi grinned, before sobering up. That's enough, Izuku, take it off before you give us a heart attack, he said with a frown. It's helping, look, I don't even need my eyes. Izuku tried and he began to maneuver himself around the living room and into the dining room without so much as stumbling, leaving his parents gobsmacked. He sat himself at the table. He heard his parents sigh and barely contained a smirk. Izuku, baby, we know you want to prove you can do things without us coddling you, Inko said. But this is not the way to show it. We worry and you won't be able to stop us from doing so. Hisashi continued, before Inko took over again. How will you manage daycare if you can't see a thing? This is silly. Take it off and stop this nonsense, baby. I'm going to spend my life blind, Mom. Izuku began. I'm not waiting to trip over feet and be ridiculed because I can't do anything because I can't see. I don't need my eyes and I'm going to show everyone that me going blind won't matter in the long run. Besides, if I'm going blind anyway, isn't it a good time to start practicing now? I don't need my eyes even now. Let me do this. I'm not letting anyone tell me what I can or can't do just because I'm going blind. Izuku, going blind and making yourself blind to prove a point isn't the same thing. It won't give you the results you're looking for. Now take it off, please, and stop going against what we're trying to do for you, Hisashi snapped. Izuku hid a scowl, keeping his face neutral as he took off the blindfold. So that didn't go the way he wanted, but they couldn't stop him from making sure he wasn't helpless when he did go blind. He snorted to himself. He knew everyone around him would only see him for his blindness, but it was like he was the one fixating on the loss of his sight. It was hard to be different. Izuku knew he wasn't like the other children. Where they were rowdy he was quiet. Where they played games at a mile a minute, he took things a step at a time. Where they were physical, he was studious, and where they were social, he kept to himself and seldom let others in. He sat quietly at the dinner table with his parents, brooding as he ate dinner. He ignored his parents' chatter, trying to make things normal between them, but how normal could a family be if the only thing on anyone's mind was the eventual blindness of one of their own? Izuku stewed in his thoughts as the meal went on, silent throughout the evening, throughout bath time and story time with his parents, and when bedtime came along, Izuku had nothing. Even worse, he didn't even have the weekend to come up with an idea to show that he wasn't some weakling. Tomorrow was a Monday. He had daycare, and with that would come the announcement of his eventual blindness, and Kachan would be insufferable then. He sighed into his pillow, eyeing the blindfold enviously. That had been a perfect plan. Too bad it would only give us a heart attack, he mimicked his parents sullenly. Not that he didn't want to stick it to his parents, but how well did he think he'd do if he was stuck under a microscope because he didn't listen? He snorted quietly. I think I'm just a little too jaded for only 4 years old, maybe I'm just smart. He shook his head, grinning to himself humorlessly. There was a reason he didn't like hanging around the other kids, the very same reason that would get him bullied. Kids flocked to whoever was strongest, Kachan, in this case, and turned their backs on anyone who was different, him. For now, it was just indifference and the odd comment against him. Tomorrow, with the announcement of his future blindness and his future Quirk's strength, Kachan would hate him and the kids would start to pick on him harder. His friend hated anyone who was stronger than him, or believed themselves to be stronger than him, that is. To him, he was the strongest, the greatest, the future #1 hero, and there's no one better than me. If you were to ask him personally. Izuku scoffed. He had the biggest ego and the worst superiority complex he'd ever seen, and it wasn't doing the boy any favors. His attitude was awful towards the other kids and especially towards Izuku. Why? Because somehow he acted like he was better than the others. How? By being smarter, of course. By not flocking towards his friend and praising him for being a jerk, apparently. No, Izuku wasn't allowed to have dreams, or a good quirk. He wasn't allowed to try or do better than him because Kachan was the best, and no one was allowed to have better grades or scores or be praised like he was. Izuku rolled his eyes before closing them. It was already late and he had to deal with Kachan tomorrow. Might as well get some peace and quiet now before the bullying allowed him no rest. He sighed as he silently slipped into dreamland. He had a long day to come in the morning and he wanted to be prepared for whatever was to come. Chapter text. See you after daycare, sweetie. Don't cause trouble for you senseis, Izuku. I found a dance studio and music instructor for your classes. The owner of the studio will be expecting us after school. Thankfully they teach all sorts of styles there, but you'll have ballet and contemporary Mondays and Tuesdays, 2 hours each. I've also asked about music classes and seeing the number of instruments you want to learn. You'll be doing 2 a day for 4 hours each, Wednesdays and Thursdays. Fridays and Saturdays will be ballet and contemporary, same hour as Mondays and Tuesdays. Did you get all that, Izuku? His mother asked. Izuku nodded to her, watching his mother drive off after their usual "I love yous," his neutral expression not once leaving his face even as the snickers and snide comments started up around him. He took a few steps before he stumbled, Kachan strutting forward with a "Move it, nerd," and a smirk snaking across his face. A shoulder check, really Kachan? This isn't the 80s, he muttered quietly to himself, under his breath, of course, so no one heard him. The snickers only increased around him after that. It seemed that no matter which world he was in, Kachan was always on the top and he on the bottom, at least no one noticed his closed eyes. His parents said no to the blindfold, they never said a thing about open eyes. Izuku's face broke neutrality to smirk for a single second before it morphed back into a neutral blankness and he held his head high as he marched into the daycare house. He couldn't see a thing with his eyes closed, but he could sense all the kids around him and the teachers moving to greet him. "Hi Midoriya-kun, it's great to see you again. Your parents told us about your situation. Now, it might feel a little lonely being apart from the other children, but... Oi, what's wrong with the nerd, is he not good enough to be around us?" Kachan exploded. Under his eyelids, Izuku rolled his eyes. The teachers glanced at each other. "Okay, gather around, guys. Our friend Midoriya-kun is going through a hard time." "Who cares, what's his quirk?" Kachan yelled. "Bakugo-kun, please don't interrupt us, we'll get to that soon," one of them scolded him lightly. Kachan pouted, but sat down on the floor, scowling, but quiet. Midoriya-kun went to the doctor to determine his quirk yesterday and got some bad news. His quirk, while we don't know what it is powerful. But for it to fit in his body, he has to lose something. For his quirk to manifest, Midoriya-kun's sight is leaving. He won't be able to see anything at all in a few years. That's when his quirk comes in. It's an elemental emitter with a mutation and sensory aspect to it. We need to treat Midoriya-kun gently, okay? You can't be rough with him because it'll be bad for his body, the other teacher told his class softly. Izuku was hard-pressed to contain a scoff. He wasn't fragile and he wasn't a charity case. He smirked to himself as a thought popped into his head. Let the bullying commence, he told himself. Kachan scowled at the floor. Okay, so the damn nerd's going blind. Why are his eyes closed now, then why isn't he looking now? He snapped. The teachers opened their mouths to speak, when Izuku interrupted them with a little smile on his face. "Because unlike you, I don't need my sight to see," and with that purposefully cryptic response, Izuku weaved around them, eyes closed, to a table, grabbing a paper with the outline of a teddy bear holding a book and some crayons and started coloring happily while the kids and teachers watched on. Some watched with awe, others amazement and some with fright in their eyes. "I don't need my sight to see," he had said. Izuku grinned to himself. That was a good line, perfect timing and brilliantly cryptic. They knew he was losing his sight, they knew his quirk would be strong and that his sight would come back, only not in a way they thought. Now, they knew that even if he didn't have his sight, he could do anything they could do. Izuku colored in his picture, content to ignore the other kids as they whispered around him, even as they tackled their own activities. Is he really going blind? Midoriya-kun's lying, he's always lying. No way his quirk's anything cooler than ours. It's a trick, no one's going to listen to him. The nerd was already a weirdo, now he's a freak on top of that, Kachan smirked. Izuku sighed quietly as the kids sniggered at Kachan's words. Sure, he'd take freak, not like he cared what they called him, as long as they knew he wasn't to be messed with. Izuku paused in his coloring, frowning to himself. If he wanted to be a hero, he needed to be able to defend himself properly. The only question was how to learn self-defense and martial arts when his parents thought gymnastics was dangerous. Not to put a pin in his plans, but if his quirk was going to come in 3 or 4 years after everyone else's, how was he supposed to keep up without being allowed to do anything? Izuku hid a scowl. Being a kid beeped. Now, he could go behind his parents' backs and try to teach himself through books and online tutorials, or he could go out and find a tutor through the coaches of his dance and gymnastics classes, though that plan was a long shot at best. No straight-laced instructor would show him a self-defense or martial arts coach without asking his parents for permission first. That wasn't done. But did he have to tell them his parents didn't know? If he could somehow get a teacher to agree to coach him and convince them he had his parents' permission without the coach meeting his parents or his parents knowing about the extra class for long enough, he could at least get the basics down and work on anything else he needed to know himself. If that didn't work, he could find an upperclassman in one of his dance or gymnastics classes that could at least show him the basics so he didn't have to learn by himself, with no experience whatsoever. He could tell that his eyesight would be completely gone once he turned 6, it was already hard to see long distances as it was, so the more time he had to watch and learn, the better. His mother and father had promised him dance, coding and music lessons and they'd delivered. His reasons for starting the classes were iffy. How would music help him in hero work, or dancing, for that matter? His parents were thoroughly confused when he'd asked for ballet and contemporary dance lessons, even more so when he asked for flute, piano, violin and guitar music lessons. With all of that, they'd decided to put him into classes immediately. He started dance lessons after school, ballet for 2 hours, contemporary on a Tuesday for the same amount of time. Wednesday and Thursdays would be for his music classes, and if 4 hours per class shocked his parents, Fridays and Saturdays, for more ballet and contemporary dance lessons scared them. Izuku knew he was putting a lot on his plate, but if the classes demanded strong physical prowess, his mom and dad would have to let him do more exercise than just yoga. As Izuku planned out a routine in his mind, he missed the glaring crimson eyes locking onto the unintentional smile he'd formed on his face, too lost in his planning to notice the growing friction between him and his once best friend. The Monday wore on, morning coming and going like a freight train, zooming by with no thought to the fun going on in the daycare whatsoever. Snack time roared by, Izuku being shoved and jostled out of the line every time he joined it, getting fed up with his smirking classmates by the time the fourth person shoved him out of the way so they could get seconds before he'd even had his first portions. He raised his hand, calmly waiting to get his teacher's attention. "What is it, Midoriya-kun?" one of them asked. "I want some snacks, but my friends aren't letting me in line and everyone's already going for seconds," he told them quietly. The kids who heard him scowled at him. Snitches get stitches, the saying went, but those who never told always let themselves be run into the ground. He wasn't afraid to get the teachers involved if it meant getting his share. Even if he had to fight dirty, he'd get his lot and the other kids would learn not to mess with him. Snitches got stitches, but snitches also weren't afraid to tell on the ones who gave them stitches and get them into trouble. The teacher frowned, put a hand on his shoulder and raised their voice, addressing the kids in line in front of Izuku. "Can someone tell me why Midoriya-kun hasn't been able to get himself some snacks?" they asked sternly. The kids froze by the snack table, the kid at the front, picking up fruit and one of the last cookies setting their plate on the table with a scowl. "Sensei, Midoriya-kun's lying. I saw him lining up when snacks were called up," a little girl with stark brown plates called out. The teacher gave both Izuku and the girl a critical eye. "Marana-chan, if that were true, Midoriya-kun would be holding a plate like you and our other friends are. Where's his? I know for a fact we always put out enough plates for all of you to grab one. There's one in everyone's hands except Midoriya-kun's. There's also still one remaining clean plate on the snack table," the teacher replied with a disappointed shake of her head. She turned to Izuku, kneeling down so she was at eye level with him. "Midoriya-kun, did you line up for some snacks when snack time was called?" she asked. Izuku nodded. "I lined up, but all the others kept pushing me out of line. When it was almost my turn to get snacks after everyone got some, they started pushing me out of line. One of them said that since I was going to be a blind freak show, I should leave the snacks for the normal kids," he explained dutifully. The teacher nodded. "Thank you, Midoriya-kun. Since there isn't much left, go finish off the fruit and the last 2 cookies. Everyone else, snack time's over. Since you don't want to play with Midoriya-kun, we'll be skipping playtime and have a lesson instead. What you've just done was mean and not tolerated. If you keep bothering Midoriya-kun, we will be talking to your parents," she scolded the kids sternly. Groans arose from their little mouths and scowls were sent his way as Izuku scooped up the last of the bananas, kiwi fruit and oranges, setting the last 2 cookies on his plate. He made his way to his table while the rest of the kids were herded to the mat for a double lesson. Usually, after snack time, they would all have playtime then a lesson. Now, instead of playtime then lesson, they would have 2 lessons, all of them except Izuku, who still had his playtime. He let a smirk crawl onto his face as the other kids glared at him. Snitches get stitches, Deku, Kacchan hissed angrily into his ear. And bullies get consequences, Bakugo-kun, Izuku hissed back, before passing by his bully and setting his plate down and stuffing fruit into his mouth. When he glanced back at Bakugo curiously, he noticed the boy staring at him, shocked into silence, just standing in the middle of the daycare house. Now that he thought about it, he'd been calling Bakugo, Kacchan, since he could first utter words, and Deku came along after a misspelling of Izuku's name, which then turned into a taunt and a slur. Kacchan hadn't been Bakugo ever since, well, ever. Izuku had only been Deku, and been mean for a few months, though, since Kacchan got his quirk before Izuku. Bakugo-kun, Matt, now, their teacher called sternly. Go on, Bakugo-kun, you're wanted, Izuku told him quietly, his closed eyes meeting Bakugo's wide, crimson ones. Gee, this isn't over, Deku. You'll pay for being a damn snitch, you nerd, the explosive blonde warned. He stalked off, joining the other kids on the mat with his usual scowl and angrily crossed arms. As if, nerd, is an insult, Izuku snarked back. Bakugo didn't hear him, it wasn't meant for anyone's ears but his own. It was true, though. Izuku was a nerd, why else was he smart enough to force the teachers to actually deal with the other kids picking on him? Why else would he prefer to read instead of roughhousing with other kids his age? Why else would he be doing crazy amounts of extra classes, and why else would he be dealing with his eventual blindness in such a methodical way? He was smart, that was why. He liked learning, liked picking the nature of objects and things apart to see how the gears fit together, how they worked, how they acted around other things, and how someone could use them to get ahead. It was why he liked analyzing. It used all the scientific and, most of the time, creative non-scientific ideas he had in his brain to understand how a quirk worked. His notes right now may not have been very good, they were written in crayon, for time's sake, but one day, he knew that his analysis would help him be a hero. Izuku dived back into his food, attacking the fruits hungrily and saving the cookies for later. Even if it was only mid-morning, he was still hungry, and being pushed out of line again and again and unable to get to the snack table did no favors to his hunger and appetite. He liked the daycare his parents had chosen, honestly, he did. There were so many books and the lessons were fun, reading and counting, though he was good at both already, with the teachers was one of the best times of the day. He didn't really like the kids, at all, but he could tolerate them if they left him to his own devices. Sharing with Bakugo, though, was the worst. The boy was arrogant and mean, always talking about how good he was, claiming he'd be the #1 hero, the next All Might, better than All Might, but to Izuku, he was nothing more than the next endeavor. All Might was the personification of peace, he advocated it with every fight and every villain he put away. With the man's brilliant, dazzling smile and declaration of, "I am here," solidified his strength in the hearts of the public. His presence alone made villain attacks decrease in percentage wherever he was. Endeavor, however, wasn't like that. The man was brusque towards fans and outright violent in fights. There was always so much collateral damage and civilian injury in the man's fights. You'd think with his almost perfect control over his flames, he'd be more controlled with where they went and be able to end his fights quickly, but no, he had to be a show-off and spew his flames everywhere. There were always people hurt in his fights, buildings and whole areas damaged by his fire. How could Izuku look up to elemental heroes when one of the strongest didn't bother to be a good person? Yet, somehow, the man was the #2 hero. All Might and Endeavor were the #1 and 2 heroes, but in Izuku's eyes, one advocated his strength and popularity and the other was a violent egomaniac. They both stopped numerous villain attacks and their capture records were nothing to scoff at, but Izuku wasn't so sure of the men off-screen. He didn't like what they stood for, didn't like how they acted as if the only thing that mattered were your strength and popularity. Because of the hero polls and the top 2 heroes, almost everyone wanted to be a hero for the fame and fortune, not to help or save people. It was turning into a fashion and idol industry. When Izuku watched the daylight, the spotlight heroes, a lot of their fights were flashy to gain the public's attention. They flaunted their quirks, showed them off so much he was surprised they hadn't been analyzed by villains and murdered yet. So yeah, heroics wasn't the industry Izuku was hoping it would be, but he was only 4 years old. Izuku had time to grow, time to mature and learn how a hero should act. He had time. With that thought, Izuku pushed the top heroes and their quirks out of his mind, promising himself he would someday figure out All Might's quirk, and opening his Braille book. If he was going to go blind, it would be after he learned how to function without his sight, not before. Izuku settled down at his table, immersing himself in the world of cleverly placed bumps that was Braille, the hum of the teacher's voices and the other kids fading out into the background as he spent yet another hour at daycare alone, in his own little world. The next few hours whirled by quicker than ever for Izuku. Lunchtime came and went, and with it, outside time. From his little table inside, Izuku watched the other kids play. It was a glorious day, he thought, with the sun a brilliant golden ball in a perfectly true blue sky. He glanced at his lunch, the Braille book, and outside to a tall tree, a smile forming on his face. "Can I eat outside today?" he asked his teachers quietly. They smiled back at him, agreeing to his request with ease and gusto, and Izuku made his way outside, settling into the shade with his back pressed up against the tree trunk. It really was the perfect lunch spot, with the tree's leafy terrace providing shade against the hot sun and the trunk as a backrest. Izuku drew up his knees, balancing his lunch between his knees and chest and his book on his knees. He ran through the letterings in the book, the alphabet with the letters underneath the Braille readings, cramming his lunch down with every pause he took. He knew he wouldn't master Braille in a day or even a week. It was a tough language, one that couldn't be spelled out because it wasn't letters or words or sounds, they were bumps on a page. Each combination of bumps was a different letter, and each combination of letters made a word. It was a literal language for blind people. Izuku knew he'd need it sooner or later, so he chose to start sooner as opposed to later. Because of his fascination with the book in his hands, he missed the 3 approaching kids marching up to him, and it was only until they ripped the book out of his hands and spilled his lunch into the dirt did he realize they were there. For once, Bakugo wasn't part of the gang of pick on Izuku kids, but he knew them. Marana Eureka, Asano Itsumi and Kiriko Kamiho, 3 of his worst, barring Bakugo, haters. Marana-chan, Asano-kun, Kiriko-kun, what do you want? Izuku asked blandly, keeping his face blank and devoid of expression. You tell us, snitcher freak. Asano sneered. Because of you, we weren't allowed playtime. Freaks like you should stay in their own lane, Marana declared with a glare. Yeah, freak, snitches get stitches. Just 'cause you're going blind doesn't mean we're letting you off the hook. Kiriko spat at him, aiming a kick at Izuku. It missed as Izuku scrambled out of the way, but Asano still held Izuku's Braille book, so running away was out of the question. Give me back my book, Asano-kun. You weren't allowed playtime because you decided to be mean and not let me have any snacks. I'm not going to let you guys bully me. Give me back my book and I won't tell sensei you were mean to me again, he warned them in a low tone. Ha, Marana snorted, you think sensei would believe you over us? Sure, Izuku smirked back, I'm the fragile, going blind kid, remember? He watched as their faces paled. Fine, take back your stupid book, it won't help you keep your sight, stupid freak, Kiriko shouted at him. Asano threw his book at him and the 3 stormed away, leaving Izuku to wonder if that's what other kids would always be like. He didn't really have any friends here, what with his entire personality and now the fact he was going to be blind at 6. It still annoyed him slightly that his quirk would only come in after his sight left. He was resigned to it, sure, but he didn't want it to go. I told you before, he mumbled to himself, I don't need my sight to see, and it was true. Maybe it was because he wasn't going to be able to rely on his eyes. He wouldn't be able to see like everyone else did. He probably wouldn't even have color when his quirk came in and he could see again, so he had to rely on something else, something that wasn't his eyes that would still let him get a grip on his surroundings. His other senses, he could use. Taste wasn't the best example, but smell, touch, hearing. All three helped Izuku tell where someone was, what they were doing, how they were doing something, and he didn't even need his eyes to tell. No one ever cared about what they had until they didn't have it anymore, and the same was said for the senses. None of the kids cared about Izuku's eyes deteriorating until they were told Izuku wouldn't be able to see anymore, and suddenly, Izuku was a freak. He was a blind freak show, and he wasn't even blind, yet. Izuku shook his head with a sigh, settling up against the tree as he'd done before Marana-chan, Asano-kun and Kiriko-kun had come along. Even if he'd only just started learning it, Izuku could safely say he both loved and hated Braille. He loved it because it was fascinating to learn and it would be of more than just help to him when he eventually went blind, but he hated it because it was difficult to learn, to say the least. There was so much of it to learn and memorize, and he only had a couple years to do so, less time than you'd think with all the hours of extra classes he'd barely been allowed to take. All the different letters, all the words, he had to go slow because so many letters felt like other letters and so many words felt like a strange combination all thrown together. Learning Braille was like learning a totally new language before you'd mastered your own native language, and it was frustrating when he couldn't get it right. Especially since Braille was based on the English alphabet. It would be annoying, Izuku thought, when he couldn't even write in anything more complex than hiragana and he had to learn a new language to be able to read and write. And he knew he could learn katakana early, before moving on to kanji and whatnot, if he hadn't thrown himself into 2 different extra classes for much longer than necessary. With Braille on top of everything else he had and wanted to learn, he would be hard-pressed to keep himself at the top of his classes. Midoriya-kun, back inside for a lesson please. You can keep learning and running through your Braille exercises after, okay? The teacher called. Izuku gathered up his spilt lunchbox and Braille book before shooting up and jogging up to the classroom door. Okay, he replied once he knew she'd be able to hear him. That was another thing the other kids in his daycare probably didn't like about him. Izuku was quiet, didn't really like talking to or playing with the other kids. He was most comfortable and worked better alone than being forced into a situation where he had to cater to the whims of other kids just to earn a passing grade and, okay, maybe a minor reading assignment in groups, where each person had to act out one scene from the same picture book wasn't too bad, but it was argument after argument as to who got Bakugo, or what book each group would use, or which group had to take the nerdy weirdo because no one else wanted him, which, come on, was a meaningless waste of time. Nothing good came out of socializing, that just didn't happen. Izuku made his way to the mat, weaving around the tables and over feet stuck out to trip him, and took a seat, away from the other kids. Is everyone here? The teacher asked kindly. There was a chorus of, yes, sensei, and the teacher grinned at them. Today, we're going to do some counting. Several children cheered and several more groaned. Izuku, who could already count to 20 and back down to 0, stayed silent. Since we can all count to 10, I thought we could try counting down, who knows what that means. A loud burst of, I do, pick me, and, I know, flew around the mat. Izuku sighed and rolled his eyes, putting his hand up calmly while the teacher did her best to quell the wellspring of noise around her. Since Midoriya-kun was the only one to listen and follow the rules, we'll let him answer and maybe he can give us a demonstration. She directed the last part to Izuku as a question. There was a lot of grumbling, whining and complaining at their teacher's decision, but Izuku ignored the other kids whinging in favor of standing up and answering the question. To count down means to go from our goal number, 10 in this case, and go back down from 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's counting up. This is counting down. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Each sequence of numbers is really just a repeat of the first 9 numbers and 0, so, theoretically, once you learn 0 to 9, You should be able to count without difficulty, Izuku said, and he proceeded to count up to 50 and back down to 0, to the shock and delight of the teacher and the shock and envy of the other kids. Gee, thank you, Izuku, that was a perfect example, although, let's stick with 0 to 10, shall we? Their teacher asked with a shaky smile. Izuku nodded consent with a quiet, yes, sensei, and sat back down again. Once more, he ignored the glares and hate-filled mutterings of the kids around him, thinking of only when he could finally finish the day and be dropped off at his very first ballet class. His parents had found him some classes about an hour after he'd asked for them. He wasn't going straight to the class, though. Inko wanted him to have the correct equipment for the class, so he'd be getting ballet flats, socks and tights with a tight-fitting white shirt to match. If that wasn't required, he'd have a singlet to wear and biker shorts instead. He heard his teacher counting with the other kids, zoning out instead of paying attention. He really didn't need the lesson. Daycare was pretty much a waste of time, now that he'd got all the basics down. Vaguely, he wondered if his parents would let him pull out of the daycare once they heard the way the kids talked about and acted towards him. Chances were, they'd just enroll him into a new one, and being the new kid halfway into the year didn't do Izuku any favors at all. If he actually managed to convince his parents to pull him out, he'd have a lot more time for the things he wanted to do. Maybe he could take up knitting, or crocheting. He could do that, right? It couldn't be that hard, could it? Maybe his parents would let him take up art classes. He had always been interested in drawing and painting, and, hey, even flower arranging would be better than sitting in a class full of kids who hated you, learning things you already knew. Briefly, Izuku thought about whether he should pay attention to what his teacher was saying, but he zoned back into the discussion only to hear the words, "Count to 20, and zoned right back out. He heard the teacher's piano start up, and it was all he could do to suppress a sigh. They were singing now. Great. How hard was it to count to 20 that they had to sing it? Again, he snorted quietly, came the thought of how jaded he was at 4 years of age. No kid his age acted aloof and bored of society, he thought. No one did. Across the city, a tired teen with eye bags under golden eyes with long, pitch-black hair sneezed. In another part of Musudafu, a boy Izuku's age with lavender eyes and matching, gravity-defying fluffy hair did the same. Both of them end up with the same thoughts running through their minds as they wipe their noses. Someone's thinking about me. Izuku kept his face blank, even as he chuckled inwardly, dreaming of his quirk and finally being about to analyze it. He wasn't the only one in his class to not get their quirk, yet, but at least he had a vague notion of what it was. All it had to do was manifest. Well, after he lost his sight completely, that is. A thought popped into his mind and he had to physically stop himself from laughing out loud. He was the one who hated being treated like a weakling, like he was a fragile flower, and what did he want to do? Run crying to his parents about how mean and nasty the other kids were, how roughly they treated him, and how the teachers never did a thing. That was his plan to get out of daycare. Boy, was he a piece of work. Izuku hoped he'd have the confidence to keep his snarky, jaded attitude in his voice when he found a person to talk to who wouldn't judge him for what was happening to his body. Izuku's zone out lasted the rest of the day, and when parents began showing up to collect their kids and they were all let outside for one last play in the yard, Izuku knew that meant he'd get to pick his equipment for his extra classes and start them. It was an exciting thought, and it was with that thought that Izuku found himself packing his backpack. Now, if only his mother would arrive. He had a busy afternoon ahead of him, and Izuku did not want to wait a second longer for the start of what he'd come to view as one of his favorite classes outside of academics. Chapter text. It didn't take long for Inko's navy blue car to come trundling down the road and into the daycare's car park. Izuku was up and running towards it before the machine had been turned off. It was unexpected of him, Izuku knew, to show how much he cared or his emotions outwards, but this was special. He knew ballet was a rather strange form of dance for him to pick, contemporary too. He knew most boys preferred hip-hop, jazz, freestyle or street, and mocked and ridiculed ballet and contemporary dancing as a girl's thing, but Izuku was an odd boy, and an odd choice of dance was just up his alley. Besides, it's not like he chose ballet and contemporary just because. No matter how much they were mocked, the two dance styles took an incredible amount of strength, stamina and flexibility to master. In the long run, they would also help improve his agility and, strangely enough, his performance in front of crowds and public persona, not that he wanted one. Something about growing up to be a hero in the spotlight irked Izuku. He wasn't the type to want to stand out. That's why he liked the heroism toss. The man sounded like a type of lolly and he wasn't very well known, but he was a good, strong hero. The man was simple and of few words, but he didn't have to talk much or to the media to be a hero. Izuku cocked his head to one side at that. He didn't have to be known to the media to be a hero, did he? He mentally shook himself out of his thoughts as his mother grabbed his hand. He already had his backpack, so all they would have to do before they left was say goodbye to his teachers. That task didn't take much time in the slightest. It wasn't long before he and Inko had walked back to the car, hopped in and buckled up, Inko buckling Izuku up in his car seat, since he wasn't quite able to do it himself, and off to the dance supply store Inko and Hisashi had found. It was, ironically, right next to the dance studio Izuku would be looking into learning at. He'd heard his mother calling. She'd told him she'd called when she dropped him off at daycare in the morning, so he knew they were expected, but seeing as he was completely unprepared and unready for the class, Izuku was to meet his instructor at the equipment store first. She'd show them what he needed and how to take care of his dance materials. Izuku's instructor had assured his mother over the phone that beginners never did anything more difficult than basics and stretching, plus a brief introduction to bar work and stances. That did nothing to quell Izuku's excitement, however. She had also explained that contemporary dancing wasn't anything hard, either. Most of the beginners and basic classes were stretches and simple body movements that would, eventually, allow the dancer a greater sense of freedom and creativity, putting the simple moves into routines that suited the dancer's personal style. All in all, Izuku couldn't wait to get started. "Izuku, sweetie, we're here, do you want some help unbuckling yourself from the car seat?" His mother's gentle voice snapped him out of his thoughts. It seemed he was thinking a lot lately, maybe it was because his sight was going bye-bye on him. He snorted, out loud, which led to his mother giving him a puzzled look. Izuku turned to her and shyly asked for some assistance, help that his mother provided happily while Izuku tried to cover a blush. He could count to 50 and back and had an entire plan to become a hero, yet he couldn't unbuckle a simple car seat. What was his life coming to? "Izu, honey, you're only 4, not being able to undo a car seat buckle isn't strange for a little boy your age," his mother giggled. "I was muttering again, wasn't I?" Izuku asked. There was a bit of a pout in his voice and he knew his mother noticed, if her next giggle was anything to go by. Inko swiftly undid the buckle and helped Izuku climb down to ground level from the car. It was parked in front of a pristine shop front, big white lettering on a soft pink background reading, "Madam's Dance Supplies." The shop wasn't enormous, but it also wasn't small by any means, with glass doors built into rusty, rose brick walls. From the minimum the pair could see, the shop indeed had everything Izuku could want as a dancer, or a new one, at least. "Hi there, are you the Midoriyas? I'm Akatsuko Kaori and I'll be Izuku-kun's ballet and contemporary dance teacher. Would you like a tour of the equipment store?" the woman asked politely. Inko stared at her in shock and Izuku regarded her with a cool wonder. The lady before them was an average height for a woman of mid to late 20 years. She was slim and wore a leotard and ballet stockings, socked feet shoved into bright, well-worn sneakers. Her body was fit, Izuku could tell that from a glance, and muscled, though that was hard to spot unless you were watching for it. It was a lean type of muscle, similar to how Izuku would imagine a runner would be built like. Her light olive skin was sun-kissed and slightly tanned. Her face was an ovular shape with a small, straight nose and a mouth that seemed to always be smiling, much like Izuku's unperfected neutral face. Her eyes were a piercing gem green, a shade darker than Izuku's own emerald eyes, but where he had fluffy dark green hair with streaks of black running through it, hers was a vibrant ginger, one side completely shaved and the other cut short, just past her ears, brushing the part of her body where her neck met her shoulders. She had small, silver studs in her ears, but no other jewelry on her, which Izuku found rather interesting. If she wore the earrings, She must have other jewelry, but she only wore the earrings now. Was there a reason for that? Yeah kid, I don't like wearing anything other than my earrings when I'm dancing and or teaching. I find they get in the way of my movements, she replied. Damn, he must have been mumbling again. That was the second time in a matter of minutes. He had to get it under control. I agree with you on that, kid, but it doesn't seem like an easy habit to break. Akatsuko-sensei grinned brightly at him. Quote. I did it again, didn't I? Izuku asked out loud, this time. Yup, now let's get on with the tour. Don't want to waste your first lesson, do you? She laughed and patted Izuku on the back, sending him stumbling as he shook his head no. He'd been waiting for this lesson all day. No way he wanted to take time from it, especially when he only had a couple years to see anything his new sensei wanted to show them. Izuku clamped his mouth shut tight, following his mother and Akatsuko-sensei into the glass doors of the dance store, doing his best to keep his face neutral. He gazed around the store with barely concealed awe and wonder in his eyes. The shop had almost everything he'd ever dreamed he'd need for any of his classes, and if he wasn't wondering how a dance equipment store also sold instruments, he was lying, which meant he had almost too much to look at and not enough eyes in his head. Eventually, after a quick tour of the store and its sections, Akatsuko-sensei led the Midoriyas to the ballet section, showing them items specifically meant for beginners like Izuku. Most of the shelf was targeted towards girls and women, seeing as boy ballet dancers were rare and in demand. Izuku wasn't quite sure how to feel about being called rare and in demand, but that thought left him as quickly as his eyesight was. He needed to stop, he thought, internally face-palming as his awful joke. So, this shelf right here usually holds everything our male beginner dancers would need. You have your usual ballet flats, without ribbons, of course, and usually only are female ballerinas, advanced in dancing grade, wear point shoes, but you will need several pairs of black flats, since they wear out so easily. You also want to include several pairs of ballet tights and a dance belt to wear underneath. You'll want form-fitting t-shirts, plain white or at the very least, colorless or a leotard, if you prefer, though that option isn't usually chosen. To finish off the list, white ankle or crew socks. We do have everything here that you'd need for Izuku-kun, though the t-shirts might be a size too big. Akatsuko-sensei winced a little at that. Izuku gazed at all the different items and clothes that adorned the several shelves that made up the beginners section of the ballet area of the store and the two full shelves of men's dance wear. There wasn't a lot in his size and, yeah, he knew he was on the short side for his age. Heck, Bakugo wasn't that much above average for boys their age and he towered over Izuku, but no shirts his size. That was silly. He said as much to Akatsuko-sensei and she burst out laughing even as his mother scolded him for being rude. Nah. His ballet instructor waved Inko off with a grin, ruffling Izuku's fluffy mess of hair. The squirt's free to say what he wants, that's part of our teaching styles. If the kids have a problem with the instructors or exercises, they speak up, but whining because something feels like it's too hard will not be and has never been tolerated, either now or in the past. Not in the future too, I hope, she muttered that last part to herself. Izuku stared up at his new, friendly dance instructor curiously and without warning, the question tumbled out of his mouth before he could stop it. What's your quirk, Akatsuko-sensei? This was one time Izuku allowed his face to heat up wildly, when he realized what he'd asked and how personal a question it was. He began bowing to Akatsuko-sensei deeply and apologizing for his rudeness. Once again, the cheerful instructor brushed it off, winking at Izuku as she did so. Cut that out, green bean, it's all good. That's usually the first question I get asked from the parents, instead of, how much will my child learn and will they like it here? She rolled her eyes, becoming serious as the sly, mischievous light in her eyes dimmed. There's a reason I don't put that on my website, nor do I tell people over the phone. I usually say it's not anyone else's business and don't answer the question, but I guess it would be for the best if I told you, huh? She knelt down taking Izuku's hand in his and staring his square in the eyes, locking their gazes together. I'm quirkless, Izuku-kun, I don't have a quirk. For a second, all Izuku could do was stare at her, shock crossing his otherwise neutral face and as she stands, pain and fear flashing in her usually lit-up face. Izuku moves. I'm going blind because of my quirk. He blurts out, hoping to get rid of the look of absolute pain and sadness on his new sensei's face. He liked her. She was going to teach him more than any of his other senseis. He knew it, so he didn't want her to be in pain. He didn't want her to be sad, or fear their reactions to her quirklessness because she didn't have what most of the population did. His crude strategy worked as shock and mild warmth and surprise flickered across her face. My quirk, it can't fit into my body as it is and remain whole, so it has to change my body. It's overriding and manipulating the neurons inside my brain that lead to my eyes. I won't be able to see anything at all in a couple years, but even worse, my quirk will have to adapt to my body before I can use it, which will take about a year. The doctor said I'd be able to harness a sensory aspect of my quirk, so I won't be sightless forever, just a year, but for an entire year, I will have no sight whatsoever, and the doctor, even after he told us all of this, was the only one to tell me I could be a hero, the only one. Izuku's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper and he was doing his best to prevent whatever tears were threatening to pour from running down his cheeks, and he sniffled, quietly, but his mother was still on him in a flash. The other woman chuckled, his sensei smiling lightly at his and his mother's antics. Izuku, baby, please don't say that so suddenly. You'll give your sensei an IA scare, she babbled. Akatsuko sensei smiled, crouching down again to face him. His senseis were doing that a lot today. I think you're going to be a great hero, Izuku-kun, were the words that came out of her mouth. Inko stiffened, frowning, but Izuku regarded her with shock, then gratitude and happiness filled his face. Thanks, Akatsuko-sensei. The woman nodded and made to stand, when a thought targeted Izuku and he gave her a tug on her leotard. She turned back to him, a question in her eyes. I think you would have made a great hero, too, but I bet you make a better dance teacher, he said with a smile. Akatsuko-sensei quickly wiped her eyes, straightening up and turning back to the ballet shelves. I think we should get back to business, but Izuku-kun. Kaori-sensei to you, okay. Okay, good boy. Now, here's what I recommend for someone of Izuku's age and size, and just like that, the brief, emotional support moment started and ended in a flash. But Izuku knew their support of each other would always lift each other up on their worst of days, and that, Izuku thought, was worth more than any lesson his parents could pay for. It wasn't long after that Izuku's arms were filled with bags full of ballet equipment and even more in his arms for his first ballet lesson. His mother had also taken the time to stock up on contemporary dance supplies and a few instruments for Izuku's music classes, though he doubted he'd need them for the first few lessons, but he guessed it was smart to prepare, or something like that. Izuku followed his mother and dance instructor, and he must have made an impression on her, since she told him to call her by her first name. It was odd, to say the least, but whatever made the woman happy, Izuku thought. He wondered what his class would be like, if there were going to be any other boys or if it would be just girls. He kind of hoped not. Girls were scarier than boys in all the right ways. He found it hard to believe there were so many people who thought women were lesser or weaker. They didn't need much strength to terrify the crap out of him, just several well-placed thoughts and sentences. His mother scared him with every snap and shout and scream, but that didn't mean he didn't love her. If only she could stop thinking he was weak and helpless because he was losing his sight. As Izuku wandered the store after his mother and sensei, he felt his thoughts starting to run away from him. They were doing that a lot recently. Was it because of his eyes, or was there something else going on with his mind? He knew he loved analyzing, and that usually meant he was away with the fairies on a regular basis, but he was also thinking during those times, so he doubted it was similar to that, but there had to be something. Izuku knew he wasn't an average kid. His lessons proved that plenty. What kind of 4-year-old signs up for 2 different dance classes and chooses to learn 4 different instruments, 3 of which he knew were classical? He knew that, somehow, in a way, one day, the skills he was learning now would help him. He wasn't sure how, exactly, or when or why he believed this, he just did. He wanted to believe in a miracle, that even with his handicap, he'd still be able to reach for the stars, shoot for the moon and land in the sky anyway with all the haters muted in the background. All wrapped up in his thoughts, he didn't notice the tiny frown that marred his fair, freckled face until Kaori-sensei pointed it out with a cheeky laugh. Green bean, what's with the cute little frowny face? Kaori-sensei pouted, grinning after a moment to show she was joking. I'm not frowning, Izuku pouted. She's infected him. Inko chuckled, smiling and setting a gentle hand on Izuku's shoulder. That's his thinking face. He does it all the time. It's a cute little habit he's picked up from Hisashi. My husband makes the same face whenever he's locked himself in a puzzle he's struggling to understand, she laughed. Kaori-sensei nodded. I get that. A lot of my girls make frowny faces like that when they're fixated on getting a move right. I tell them that if they stop trying to focus on the move and let their bodies move to the music, they'll get to the level they want to be at. His dance teacher replied with a good-natured chuckle. So I stopped thinking. Izuku scrunched his eyebrows together in confusion. This must have been the most emotion he'd shown since he was old enough to know what emotions were. That sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? Kaori-sensei asked with a tinkling laugh. Izuku's confusion grew. Counter what? He questioned. Counterintuitive. Actions that are the opposite or different from the end goal you've given yourself, like using instinct or not thinking on a puzzle that requires thinking or intense brain power. Using your gut instincts may not really be the best way to solve a thinking or logic puzzle though. That's not very logical. Izuku let himself smile at his joke. Kaori-sensei grinned and ruffled his wild, curly mane of hair. Very funny. Green bean, but enough time wasting. We've got everything you need. The first visit is half off, since specialized materials and instruments are expensive, but I'll give you a tour of the studio next. Midoriya-san, did you want to join us? Inko shook her head, giving her son a quick, fierce hug. No, I see my son's in good hands with you. Izuku, I'll see you in a few hours, be good for Akatsuko-sensei. She gave Izuku a kiss on the forehead as Kaori-sensei led them to the till, where Inko paid for Izuku's dance and music supplies. She bundled everything Izuku wouldn't need in his first lesson up into her arms and into her car, driving off soon after, leaving Izuku with Kaori-sensei outside a dance studio and supplies store. She turned to him and grinned wolfishly. You're all mine, green bean, she cackled. Kaori-sensei took him by the hand and marched him to the building beside the supplies store. The building was black painted with pale pink trimmings and a sign out front reading the name of the studio and the styles of dance taught. It was a larger building than the store, wider and flatter rather than taller. The door was a pale pink, just like the trimmings, and his new sensei led him inside, leading him first to a set of changing rooms, males to the left, females to the right, where she left him to struggle into his new dance outfit, then led him into a wide room. The floor was a lovely polished brown that made it shine. The entire wall opposite to the door was a ceiling-to-floor mirror, and wooden bars set at head height spanned the two walls adjacent to the mirror wall and door. In one corner of the room were a small cluster of little girls, all taller than him, Izuku noticed with a little frown, dressed like Kaori-sensei in dance-footed dance tights and pale pink dance flats instead of black, he noticed, with matching leotards and hair in high ponytails. Izuku looked around curiously. He had wondered if there were any other boys, but it looked like this answered his question. I thought there would be more boys, he remarked quietly. Kaori-sensei gave a quick huff of laughter. Nah kid, you're the only boy in our beginner class. There are 1 or 2 males in our advanced and senior classes, but you're it here. Izuku nodded thoughtfully, trundling behind Kaori-sensei as she stepped into the room, quietly waiting to either be introduced or noticed by one of the girls. It turned out to be the latter, Izuku saw, when one of the girls who had their backs to them turned around, in the middle of tying her ponytail with a white ribbon. Her face lit up when she saw Kaori-sensei, and even further, if possible, when she saw Izuku. Akatsuko-sensei, is that a boy? She squealed in delight. Kaori-sensei laughed out loud at the girl's exclamation, particularly as the other 5 girls had sun around to face them, all eyes centered on Izuku. Calm down, girls. This is Midoriya Izuku. He'll be starting with us Mondays and Fridays. He'll also be in your contemporary classes, Fuko-chan, Haruki-chan, on Tuesdays and Saturdays, so don't traumatize him so soon, girls, Kaori-sensei grinned. Yes, sensei, came the dutiful chant of the 6 girls. Now, Izuku-kun, we'll be starting with the basic positions, since this is your first class, but your mother bought a book of basic ballet moves and stances, so I want you to read through that and learn some of those, alright? I know you're already set in quite a busy schedule, but I expect you to at least try to practice outside of classes. Even if it's just a run-through of the basics, you'll find you'll improve faster if you do. Got it, sensei, Izuku told her quietly. Good. Is everyone ready? Yes, sensei. Floor positions, front and center. Izuku scrambled to find a place on the floor with the girls, stunned by the sudden change in his sensei. She'd turned from friendly and lighthearted to a strict and stern ballet teacher. He got in line, glancing at the girls' positioning for future reference. They stood straight-backed, impressive for 4 to 5-year-olds, he thought. Their feet were together at the ankles, but spread out at the toes to make a V shape. Their hands made an ovular shape, their hands in front of their waists, but not touching, their hands close at the fingers, but not touching. Their fingers were spread the tiniest amount, their thumbs tucked into their palms. He took a double take, then raised a hand. Do I have to do that too? Every time? Seriously? He saw Kaori-sensei's lips twitch in amusement. Yes, Izuku-kun, your stances and movements won't always be the same as the girls, but the basic feet and arm positions are. Now then, girls, run through the 5 basic feet and arm positions, please. Izuku-kun, take notes of how the girls stand and move. Your own movements will be a little heavier and slightly less graceful than theirs, but it won't be by much, understand? For now, just try and copy the girls, okay? Yes, sensei. Izuku watched as the girls in his class ran through 5 stances and arm positions, looking on in awe at their grace and flow. Every exercise, from 1 to 5, bled into the next and there was barely a pause in motion. After the 3rd run-through of the basics, Izuku nodded and joined in. He followed along as best he could, a beat behind the girls and with far less grace and elegance, but he managed to complete a couple of rounds. It took a lot more concentration than he'd thought it would, often having to be reminded to point his toes out, widen his stance or keep his thumbs tucked into his palms. He marveled at the ease with which the girls in his line managed to go over the basics. It took a while, but when Izuku could perform the 5 positions with similar ease and motions, they moved on from the floor work into the bar, for bar work. If Izuku thought that would be easier, he was absolutely wrong. It was like relearning a language you knew, but hadn't practiced in a while, except that language was upside down. It was much the same basics, but altered for easier access at the bar, and it was all done with their right hands resting firmly, but not exactly gripping, the bar. It was a workout and a half, he soon learnt, since, by the time the 2-hour lesson came to a close, Izuku was groaning and aching all over. Are you all right, Midoriya-kun? One of the girls asked with a knowing smile. I have bruises on my bruises, Retsu-chan, he complained, straight-faced. The girls around him laughed at his poor attempt at a joke, giving him condolences but no sympathy whatsoever. He hoped he wouldn't be so sore for his next dance lesson tomorrow, but he knew that was probably a lost hope. Are you all right, Izuku-kun? Kaori-sensei asked him with a twinkling smile. Izuku regarded her with a deadpan expression and articulated, very, very clearly. No, she laughed at him and shook her head, gesturing for him to follow her. Copy me, these are some stretches you should find simple and easy to do. They'll help your muscles develop and also cool yourself down so you won't feel so sore in the morning. Do these before and after each practice. It doesn't have to be a formal lesson, but if you stick to them, you'll get the results you're looking for. I'll also talk to your mother about cardio exercises you'll probably want to look into if you're wanting to do ballet and contemporary long term. They won't be too hard so your parents don't kick up a fuss about you being fragile since you're going blind, Kaori-sensei scoffed good-naturedly. It's annoying they think I can't take care of myself, Izuku muttered. Kaori-sensei nodded understandingly. Mine were the same way. Don't do that, Kaori-chan, you'll hurt yourself. You can't go with the other kids because they play a little too rough and you'll end up injured. You can't be so smart because you're quirkless and obviously less evolved than your peers. She rolled her eyes. Adults think they're doing what they think is best for you, but never ask what you think is best for you. They try, but it's never going to be enough, is it? Is their support too much to ask for? In some cases, probably. It's already hard enough to get people to believe in people who are different, but you and I, a quirkless freak and a blind dreamer. That's all we'll be to the public. That's why we have support systems. I support you, you support me, and when you're older, I'll take you to the support groups I've found over the years. Does that sound good? Yeah, Izuku smiled up at her as they stretched. That sounds good. It took another few minutes for them to finish up their stretches, trying to give every part of their bodies another short workout before Izuku's mother arrived. Izuku broke out a wide smile at his instructor, something he refused to show other people around him. He knew his parents and the senseis at his daycare were getting concerned. He didn't act like any kid they knew, so of course they would. He smiled at Kaori-sensei, though. She understood him. She'd been through the same thing, and even if he was only 4, even if he didn't really understand the world yet, he knew that Kaori-sensei would have his back. He wondered if the support groups and communities would accept him. Did she know he was going to have a strong quirk? Would anyone want him after he told him? He left the dance studio with his mother's hand in his, once again lodged into his mind, thinking. When he got just a little older and lost his sight, but gained his quirk, people would look at him one of two ways. He's weak and helpless because he couldn't see, or he had a really strong quirk that he could do great things with. Was it so hard to just find someone who believed in him because he was himself? Did he really have to work so hard just to find one person who actually thought he could achieve his dream? Kaori-sensei thought he could do it. She was the only one, though. His parents didn't believe him. Did you have a fun lesson, Izuku? His mother asked him. I learned a lot today. Kaori-sensei showed me some stretches and really simple workouts to help with muscle development and flexibility, he told her. Inko frowned thoughtfully, glancing at her son through the rearview mirror of her car as she drove the both of them home. I'm not sure, baby. Are you sure this will be safe with your condition? She asked worriedly. I know I can do it. I want to be prepared for my lesson tomorrow. I want to be prepared. Same for my music classes. Even if those won't take much physical ability, Izuku replied softly, hiding a pained, cracking heart underneath a layer of walls. No, I suppose they wouldn't. I'll talk with Hisashi. We'll see what he says, okay. In other news, I spoke with the Jiros. Your classes will be joint with their daughter. They want to teach her as many instruments as she wants to learn, starting with classicals. Would that be okay? That's fine. Maybe I'll like her, Izuku replied. Inko nodded and tried to keep the conversation alive, but Izuku fell silent, not responding to anything his mother might have said. His parents wanted a frail, blind child, and the kids at daycare wanted a blind freak. Why not? He thought. Why not give them both what they wanted? Chapter text. Welcome, Midoriya-kun. I'm Jiro Mika. This is my husband, Jiro Kiyotako. This may seem a little strange, but he'll be your piano, flute and violin teacher. I'll be your guitar instructor. The smiling woman in the doorway of the plain, two-story house introduced herself. She, her husband and a little girl with Mika's dark purple hair and slivers of her father's black in her bangs stood in front of the husband and wife pair. She took after her mother with a slim, lithe build, but after her father with their matching partial scowls on their pale faces. Her hair was cut in a diagonal bob, however, starting from just under her left ear to just above her right shoulder. She wore all black with a splash of dark purple, a common theme among the family, Izuku noticed as he quietly observed them. Jiro-san's kind smile never wavered with his silence, but Kiyotako and the girl shifted ever so slightly. Are you going to say something? The girl snapped abruptly. By her side, her mother placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed lightly in warning. By his side, his mother stumbled for words. All right, sweetie, I'll leave you with the Jiros for your lessons. I have some shopping to get done. I'll be back for you after your lessons, okay? All right, Mom, I'll see you later, he replied quietly, even as she fussed over him before rushing to her car and heading off, much like she had the previous Monday and Tuesday, except this time it was for music classes instead of dance lessons. So he does speak, the girl smirked, How well does he play? Poorly. I bet. This is my first lesson, goth girl. Ooh, a cryptic thinks he's so smart, she rolled her eyes. You have more sass than a 4-year-old should, what's got you so jaded? Izuku retorted. As if you aren't the same way, she snarked back. At least I'm not rude. At least I'm not short. That made a tick mark appear in his face. Well, at least I'm not. All right, children, that's enough. Midoriya-kun, this is our daughter, Jiro. Jiro Kyoka, but Jiro to you, newbie, she interrupted her mother. Whatever you say, goth girl. Jiro narrowed her eyes at him. Don't call me that, I won't, as long as you don't call me newbie. Izuku glared at her as she glared back at him, when they both smirked. I like him, she said off-handedly to her parents, who were barely containing puzzled expressions as it were. Izuku had to confess he was messing with them as he inclined his head with a solemn expression. Likewise, Jiro-san, Kyoka, to you, Midoriya-kun. Very well then, Kyoka-chan, Izuku to you as well. They smiled at each other, before shaking hands with a nod. Okay, kids, break it, whatever it is, up, please, Kyoto intervened in their little ritual, leading the both of them inside the Jiro's house. It was a homely setting, Izuku thought as he looked around, discreetly, he might add. There were instrument stands with said instruments in them spotted around the living room around furniture, as well as the usual house decorations, vase of flowers on top of side tables and cabinets, books set up on the coffee table in the middle of the lounge, a TV set up at the back of it, soft carpeting, a bench and table in the kitchen cleaned of afternoon tea dishes and now laden with a few snacks and refreshments for in between his instruments, he guessed. This way, Midoriya-kun. We'll be starting with the flute. I don't suppose you have one of your own? Kyoto-sensei asked him, and silently, Izuku produced the flute his mother had bought him on Monday out of its case, brandishing his violin case as he did so. Kyoto-sensei whistled, impressed. Not many first-timers choose their instrument perfectly, he said. Why's that? 'Cause those idiots always rush into an instrument shop and buy the first one they see without knowing anything about it. Instruments have sizes, and depending on yours, you buy a specific size of instrument. Too big and you won't be able to play it properly. Too small and you'll find it hard to play it at all, Kyoka interrupted with a scoff. That's a little silly, isn't it? He asked with a snort of amusement. Totally. That's why I called them idiots, Kyoka retorted with a smirk. Kyo, go grab your one and meet us in the studio, please, and try to hold yourself back from any more smart-ass comments to Midoriya-kun, his tone took on a pleading nature. Sure dad, but no promises, Kyoka called back to him as she strolled off to grab her instruments. Right this way, kiddo, we'll be using the studio for your lessons. It's the perfect place for them. Mika will probably want to start guitar lessons out here in the lounge until you get more experience with it. Piano's also up here, too, so your teacher for that will be a 50-50 split most of the time, Kyoto-sensei explained to him on their walk through the house, down a set of stairs and into a pristine room full to the brim of instruments. I've got it, Dad. But if we're only learning the basics because of Izuku-kun, why am I here? Kyoka asked with her head tilted to the side curiously. Kyoto-sensei laughed brightly. Well now, I could always use a teaching assistant so these go faster, he told her. She grinned delightedly and Izuku just sighed. You're just as weird as I am, you know that. He sighed with a head shake. Well, you know what they say. Kyoto's grin grew just a little sharper, Kyoka's grew to match her father's. We may be crazy, she cackled, and Izuku groaned as he fell right into their trap. But it just might be a lunatic you're looking for. They sang together. You're meant to be teaching me the flute, not running through Billy Joel songs to torment me, he grumbled out. Kyoto and Kyoka sniggered, before conceding and proceeding to begin Izuku's first half of his first music lesson. He knew he wouldn't be touching his flute for the most part, but did the theory work have to be so boring? It was repetitive and fairly easy work, the scales and notes simple to memorize back to front. To Izuku, it was like reading Braille, easy to read at first, but somewhat troublesome to put it all together. By the end of the first hour, Though, Izuku could read the sheet music Kyoto-sensei gave him with a stutter or pause, and by the Jiro's faces, that wasn't exactly normal. Of course, by now it should have been common knowledge. Well, Kyoto-sensei smiled at him. We've done all the basic theory work you'd need at this point for all three of your classical instruments in the 1 hour. Do you want to try playing? You're letting him start now? Kyoka asked incredulously. Kyoto-sensei chuckled good-naturedly, ruffling his daughter's hair fondly. He's as fast a learner as you are, Kyo. He doesn't need anything more than the basic scales, notes and chords for the basic classical pieces he'll be learning his first year. Why not start him now? I'm confused. How long does this stuff usually take? Izuku asked, not at all bothered with intruding on his sensei's personal moment with his daughter. Usually the first few lessons. I'd expected to cover your theory work in today's 4-hour lesson and start with the instruments tomorrow, not finish all the theory you'd need for your first pieces in an hour. The man grinned at Izuku. Let's take a quick break, then we can start you with either your flute or violin. We'll split the hours 1.5 for each instrument. Your piano lesson tomorrow will be 2 hours, your guitar lesson will be half theory work, half practical. Now let's get up and see the light of day, before we bury ourselves down here for the rest of the day, he laughed. He led the way up the stairs from the basement studio and into the dining room, where Mika-sensei had laid out fresh juice and cookies for them. She looked surprised to see them out so soon, if her raised eyebrows and crinkled mouth was anything to go by. Up so fast? She asked with a smile. He's finished the theory work as fast as Kyoka did. We're starting him on instruments. Kyo's going to be helping so he learns just a little faster than he already is, he grinned. Mika-sensei's eyebrows rose even further. She turned to Izuku with a cheeky smile. Well, if you're learning at the pace you are, want to learn more? Izuku couldn't stop the wide grin spreading across his face. He was sure the theory work had only taken so long because each scale and notes for each instrument were mostly the same, but had a slight difference in meaning, and learning 3 different theories for 3 different instruments would have taken time for anyone to learn. I'm glad you do want to. I'd be trying to learn all I can as fast as I can, especially if I was losing my sight. Kyoto-sensei shrugged, then froze as Izuku's piercing eyes fell on him. They were sharp and narrowed, his mouth twisted into a frown. Kyoto, Mika-sensei hissed, elbowing him roughly in the side. The man winced, glancing apologetically at Izuku. Kyoka's eyes darted confusedly from her parents to Izuku, who avoided her gaze, his expression turning as blank and guarded as a sheet of paper, the same one he used for the kids and senseis at daycare and his parents. Mom, Dad, what do you mean? Why'd he say you're losing your sight? Are you going blind? Is that why you're learning so many instruments so quickly? The questions rushed from Kyoka's mouth, because no matter how smart or snarky the girl seemed, she was still, at heart, a curious little 4-year-old. Kyoka, honey, let's sit down. Izuku-kun, do you want to explain or do you want us to? I'm going blind because my quirk has a mutant variation with the emitter aspect. It's replacing and overriding the neurons in my eyes to match them to a sensory aspect of my quirk. I'll be fully blind in a couple years. My quirk's going to come in a year after I do, he said bluntly. He was so used to having other people explain it so delicately, expecting him to be some sort of fragile flower, but he wasn't. He was just as capable as anyone else, his fading sight be damned. So, what's that have to do with anything? She snorted. Exactly. Izuku threw his hands in the air. I'm going blind, not dying. I'm going to be a hero either way, and a lack of sight isn't going to do anything to stop me, he scowled. Kyoka smirked boldly, eyeing her parents. I told you I liked him, she said sassily. Someone my age should not have so much attitude, Izuku snorted, smiling at her lightly. Oh dear, you kids are going to be the origin of many headaches. Kyoto-sensei shook his head with a fond grin. I think you 3 have spent enough time up here. Go on, back to lessons with you 3. Mika-sensei chuckled, nudging her husband and shoving him, Izuku and Kyoka, back to the studio stairs. So what are we learning first? Izuku asked, once they'd entered the basement studio. Kyoto-sensei grinned at him, then shrugged. I don't know, you tell me. Izuku's bafflement must have shown on his face, because the 2 Jiros giggled at him cheekily. Forget headaches, Kyoto-sensei, you two are going to give me migraines, he complained. Admit it, you love us, the Jiros smiled at him in unison. Izuku took one look at the pair and ran out of the studio, up the stairs and burst into the living room, startling Mika-sensei. Her shock morphed into a light-hearted grin. That took longer than expected, she told him. Please tell me you know how to play these and can teach me instead of those headaches. He practically begged her. Mika-sensei laughed at him, nodding her head. Come on, we'll work here while my husband and daughter are busy laughing at your pain, she chuckled. Izuku took out his flute and Mika-sensei brought out one from their family's collection. The Jiros, Izuku had learnt over the past few days from research, were well-known musicians and dabbled in everything from rock to classical, and they were the ones his parents had found to teach him. They started slowly, Mika-sensei playing a note and Izuku copying her, playing the scale up and down again and again, until Izuku could do it matching Mika-sensei's pace. It was a little harder than he thought, figuring out which notes all the little holes on the top of the instrument, when covering one or two, would play what note, but he figured it out. It was reading the sheet music and playing from sight alone that would prove to be the real challenge. For the moment, all Izuku had to do was follow the movements and copy the playing of his sensei, which wasn't as hard as it sounded. A half hour later, Mika-sensei retrieved a flute playbook, a stand and sheet music for nursery rhymes Izuku may or may not have memorized because his daycare senseis thought they'd suit his music classes. Mika-sensei played one song, then showed Izuku the notes corresponding to the words, having him play the song one note at a time until he'd run through the song. She then had him run through the song in its entirety. Slowly, very slowly, Izuku fumbled his way through, Twinkle, twinkle little star, Mary had a little lamb, Ba, ba, black sheep, Hush, little baby, and Incy Wincy spider. By the end of the first hour and a half, he could play the basic nursery rhymes without pause or stutter. It wasn't perfect, but the songs flowed nicely and he could at least tell what songs they were. Mika-sensei allowed him a short break and then they repeated the process with the violin. Process with the stringed instrument was slower than the wind, but he managed to make his way through the scales and notes slowly. He tried his hand at Twinkle Twinkle, and though it wasn't very good, he could at least play the song. He was running through it again, when he and Mika-sensei were interrupted by a knock at the door. Izuku startled out of his playing and glanced at the time, startled at how quickly the time had passed. Mika-sensei smiled at his shock. She, too, used to be surprised at how fast time passed when she was playing or singing. That should be your mother now, Kyotoko, go let her in, please, and remember your manners, Kyoka. Mika-sensei called out with a twinkle in her eyes. Izuku barely contained an eye roll. Of course they'd been watching him practice, he'd have to work on his situational awareness, especially if he was going to be a blind hero. Yes mom, sure, dear, came the twin responses. Izuku fought off a smile, the Jiros really were a strange set of people. He liked them, really. Like Kaori-sensei, they didn't care about his future blindness or mocked his dream. He wondered if his parents would eventually do the same, believe in him for once in their lives. He gave his mother a quick hug, bid the Jiros goodbye and bundled up his instruments, music book and took the sheet stand Mika-sensei offered him. If he was going to be practicing at home, he would need a stand of his own to practice with, and apparently the Jiros had plenty to share. Mika-sensei, though, did tell him that he'd need to start buying his own when he needed them. All in all, it was an eventful day full of humor and exasperation, and he wondered if the Jiros always acted like happy, carefree crazies. He couldn't help it, he thought with an internal wry smile. He couldn't wait for his next lesson. The weeks flowed together after his first lessons. The passage of time seemed but a speck of time as the days passed. They blended together, and even though Izuku immersed himself in his classes and lessons, he'd been getting good at ballet, Kaori-sensei had told him, and in just 6 months, half a year, he'd moved from a beginner's class into normal dance lessons. His music classes had also progressed. He was now ready to take lessons with Kyoka. Their friendship had grown steadily throughout their frequent interactions at the Jiros' home, and it was more of a friendly rivalry, to see who could learn different songs or music progressions faster or better than the other. It was interesting, he thought, just how much he had integrated into his music sensei's lives. They were inviting him over for playdates with Kyoka, over for dinner, the night, and with all his activity, he'd all but forgotten about the steady declination of his sight. Over a half year, it wasn't noticeable at all, just slowly losing distance of sight, how far he could see, not that it mattered much. His dance and music lessons never required much long-distance viewing, and he was in the middle of learning how to follow a dance routine without his eyes, or how to tell a musical composer from the chorus of a song without looking at the sheet music. He was having fun, learning to do things without one of his 5 important senses, and it wasn't easy. Daycare was less and less fun with every day he spent there. His senseis had learned of his lessons, music and dance, and he was often volunteered to play along on the piano or his flute or violin if he had them to nursery rhymes and other simple songs his senseis decided to play that day. It only alienated Izuku from his peers even further, and it was only the fear of how expensive musical instruments were that stopped the other kids from vandalizing his cases or the instruments themselves. It was why he didn't bring them often, only when requested and only ever when his mother told him to. It was getting harder to keep an eye on them, when he had to bring them along to daycare. He hated that he had to go, but there were laws, apparently, that said he couldn't be home alone without anyone else in the house. He could look after himself perfectly fine, thank you very much. Inko and Hisashi told him it was so he could socialize and make friends with kids his age that didn't have such a bleak outlook on life. Kyoka didn't count, they'd said, because she was practically his twin social outcast. So he went along with them. He could tell they were growing increasingly worried and frustrated towards him. It wasn't hard to figure out, he didn't feel like he could trust or confide in them, didn't feel like he could let them in. His black face, his expressionless and soft-spokenness towards them matched his attitude towards the kids at daycare and society whenever he went on an outing with his parents, but not his Kaori-sensei, Hyotoko-sensei, Mika-sensei and Kyoka and his dance class companions. Since he'd started his classes, he had grown a little, he was taller, more flexible and agile. The workouts and stretches did wonders and patches of lean muscle had started coating his body. Izuku had to almost beg his parents to start taking him on morning and evening runs. He was proud to say he was the only one in his daycare class to be able to do the splits, front and side, the back bend, back flip, front flip, forward rolls and specialized routines meant for dancers and gymnasts. Along with the lessons, Kaori-sensei had pulled through for him. Self-defense. Izuku knew Inko and Hisashi would never approve. No, self-defense wasn't something a helpless almost blind kid could do. They weren't allowed to, so Kaori-sensei taught him when she could, in between classes, before and after lessons, even during if she thought she could get away with it without letting the girls in. 6 months flew by before Izuku knew what was happening, and soon after that, 6 months more. Izuku, with all of his activity, didn't really have time for anything else, and if his parents and senseis weren't always worried about how far and how much he could see, he'd forget about his eye problems entirely. He'd managed to convince his parents to enroll him in a gymnastics course, so now he had that on top of everything else he had going on, but they decided to wait until he'd gotten a little bit older to start him on coding and programming. That was all right. A year came and went, and with it his birthday. No matter how smart or world-weary he might have appeared, his birthday was still a special time for him, and this year, he had Kaori-sensei and the Jiros to keep him company if his parents couldn't join him. He enjoyed his new class, especially since his ballet and contemporary dance styles helped him along with the basics and into a more advanced class. His classes kept him occupied, and he was glad. They kept him from dwelling on his eyes, but it didn't help for long, when every day, his eyes grew worse and worse. He ignored it for as long as he could, which wasn't long, really, until it all changed. Everything changed, on his 5th birthday. The day in question started off as any other day did. His father had to rush into work, and his mother had gotten an emergency call into the hospital to work. It was unfortunate, but another birthday spent at daycare, what fun. Not. Izuku sighed, sitting in the back of the car with his mother at the wheel. He glanced out the window, at the, wait, what was that? Izuku squinted. the scenery outside melting into a bunch of colors and shapes. It was like everything bled into the one giant blob. Though, a very faint blob. Vibrant colors were dull and light, and trees and objects were an outline and not a solid object. What the heck was going on? Was this how sight was supposed to go? Mom, my eyes have gotten worse, he called. His voice was soft, but urgent. What? Inko's head twisted around to meet his eyes, her own filled with shock and pain. She never realized she was still driving, nor that the intersection traffic light ahead of her had just turned red for her. She never saw the truck headed straight for her car as she crossed the intersection line, and the last thing Izuku saw was his mother's panicked face as the truck's horn blared out, before their car and the truck collided and the world around him crumbled into darkness. Hisashi hated running. He hated any physical activity that made him move his body faster than a slow jog, but the news from the call he had gotten that day had him sprinting out of his office, down the stairs and out of the building to his car, absolute terror in his crimson eyes. As fast as he could manage to, Hisashi was buckled up in his car and speeding down the main road to Musudafu General Hospital, where his wife and son were admitted after a truck collided with Inko's car. The impact snapped her neck. She died on the spot. Izuku was still alive, thank goodness, but with his eyes already in such a fragile state, it was unlikely he'd ever see again. Along with the loss of his sight, his left arm was fractured in 3 places in his lower arm, and his right foot had been crushed under one of the car's seats. His calf on his left side had been pierced by shards of glass from the windscreen, and his right shoulder was dislocated. With all the injuries, full health and recovery would take a half a year, possibly 7 months with all the therapy, physical and otherwise, his son would be attending. His son was in surgery at the moment, and it was taking Hisashi all he had not to scream out of frustration. Traffic was building up around him. He was stuck in place on the road, unable to reach his son, and it was mentally draining. It was Izuku's 5th birthday. His birthday, and Hisashi wasn't even there in the morning to wish him a happy birthday. Now, Izuku was in the hospital, his mother was dead, and he wouldn't be walking, taking lessons, or even seeing ever again. Hisashi snorted humorlessly, doing his best to keep his tears at bay. The day wasn't supposed to go like this, it wasn't. He doubted he'd ever be able to look Izuku in the eyes after this. He stared out his windscreen, the line of cars and their red deceleration lights looking back at him, angrily lit up. He grit his teeth, narrowing his eyes, then throwing the wheel sideways, turning it violently and parking where he could. Hisashi leapt out of the car, running through the streets as fast as he could to get to the hospital where his son lay on an operating table, when the sound of sniffling reached his ears. The sound came from an alleyway near him, and it was quiet, like a kid's, but if that were so, the child wouldn't have been any more than a couple years older than Izuku at most. Hisashi frowned and followed that sound down into the alley, only to find a child with blue-gray hair, wild and messy, with bright red eyes, hunkered down in the trash and grime at the back of the alley. The boy, because it was a boy, eyed his warily, suspicion buried deep in his eyes. "Are you all right, child?" Hisashi asked him kindly. The boy glared at him, and Hisashi sighed, reaching a hand out for him to take. "The heroes abandoned you, haven't they? They didn't save you, and everyone else has left you to rot in this alley. How do you feel about that?" Hisashi plowed forwards. The kid's gaze grew more sad, the anger dying inside his eyes, but Hisashi could see it simmering below the surface, and, well, he needed a successor, no matter how far away he distanced himself from his less-than-legal work. "What's it to you? Will you help me, save me?" The boy spat, but the words were weak, there was no fire to them. "Boy, the very meaning of save is to rescue you." "I can't do that," Hisashi began. "Then leave me here and go find someone who can. But if even the heroes won't help me, who would?" The boy interrupted bitterly, spitting the words out like poison. Hisashi shook his head. "You didn't let me finish. I cannot save you, but I can help you forge a new path for yourself, one that you are the master of. This world, this society is corrupt. Heroes take on the title for only the fame and fortune, but you, could change that. So no one is let down by villains calling themselves heroes, by liars who parade around in costume. yet do nothing when it counts, by abusive families and schools, by bullies who attack the weak. This is what I can give you. I can create for you a new life. Would you take it? Seize the opportunity. The decision is yours, child. I will not interfere with your answer. The boy bit his lip and Hisashi knew he had won. Izuku would probably hate him, despise him for what he was doing, abandoning him in Inko, leaving Izuku alone, but society as it was could never let his boy rest. His adorable, blank-faced boy would never know peace for being the way he was. It had to be reshaped. It had to be reformed and molded into a proper place to raise a child in, and the world would change, starting with the end of the profession of hero. He would do it, with the help of the boy before him, all for his son, for Izuku. It was all for Izuku and Inko. Are you sure you want me? My quirk, my power, it's A.V., villain's quirk, D.U.S., still want me? The boy asked Hisashi, on the verge of a meltdown. Hisashi crouched down in front of him, gently and slowly reaching out a hand to touch him. The boy's quirk must be something of great strength for a 5-point activation quirk, going by the way the boy held his hands close to his body, clenching and unclenching them subconsciously. There is no such thing. There are only those who use their quirk to harm and those who use their quirks to save. I will not lie to you. If you come with me, we will be labeled as villains for what we will do, but make no mistake, civilians are not to be harmed. This is a war between the heroes and those who are not content with society as it is. My battle is against them and I refuse to waste lives. Boy, do you understand? If you come with me, we may be called villains, but even villains have a code of honor. The boy glanced up at Hisashi, his eyes matching his, and he nodded. You'll help me see, control my quirk. He stuttered. Hisashi nodded resolutely. I can, but let me be clear. By coming with me, you're agreeing to a life under the radar until we strike, and inevitably, the heroes, HPSC, strangers on the street, no one will be on your side except our allies, other villains. I don't care. You saved me and you're a villain, not a hero, not some NPC on the street, you. So yeah, I'll go with you. If this society needs to change, teach me how to change it. The boy scowled. Hisashi nodded again and took the boy's hand, careful not to touch all 5 fingers, and led him towards his car. You said you had a son. Why are you taking me if you have him? Hisashi smiled at him, just before the car crashed into traffic. Because he doesn't deserve to grow up in a world like this. The car blew up in flames, but when the police arrived, the bodies were gone. Chapter text. The high-pitched noise delved into Izuku's subconscious and he stirred, his eyelids twitching. It was the pain that hit him first. His body burned as if it were set on fire and he gasped, his eyes flying open. The machine by his side lit up, beeping faster and faster until the door burst open and nurses and a doctor flooded in, trying to calm him down. It worked, for the most part. He lay in the white-sheeted bed in the white-walled room, his mind working overdrive. What happened? Where was his mother? His father? What day was it and why? Why were there a land of clouds over his eyes? Why couldn't he see? Ah, you're up, I see. A loud, boisterous voice had Izuku jumping. He flinched as the pain hit him again. I can't see, he said bluntly, quietly. The back of your head took a nasty hit. No concussion, thank goodness, but your eyes, which were already under stress, were damaged badly. You no longer have sight in them. You won't regain sight in them, either. The doctor's voice became more subdued. Oh, my mommy. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. Her neck was snapped on impact. My daddy. He was in another car crash on his way to the hospital 3 days ago. The car went up in flames and no bodies were discovered. He burned alive. It was my birthday, Izuku said, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. I'm 5, now. Do you think my quirk will come in faster? On that note, we don't have an exact date, but we had your quirk doctor come in and he said that due to the sudden acceleration of your sight loss, your quirk will be coming in sometime this year. Where am I going? He asked softly. We're keeping you in the hospital for a few months, to make sure everything heals up right, but you've been assigned a social worker and they're hunting around for a placement for you. Oh, thank you, kid. I'm going to be honest, do you even understand what I'm saying? The doctor frowned at him, but Izuku couldn't tell. He turned his head towards where he thought the doctor's voice came from, relying on his nose and ears instead of his eyes. Mom and Dad always said I was advanced for my age, he replied. The doctor sighed. You don't need to be so calm right now, the man said, softer than anything before. You just turned 5, right? You lost your parents on the same day. You're allowed to be upset. Izuku listened to the doctor, a war waging inside of him. His parents were gone. They weren't coming back. It was his birthday. He'd never seen them again. He'd never get to hear his mother's laugh or his father's bad jokes. He'd never see the way they dressed and their myriad of expressions. He'd never be able to smell their cooking, or get gifts from them. They were gone. On the other hand, he'd never have to listen to their overprotective worries or their concern over what he could and could not do. Never see their faces when he did something cool to him that was unacceptable to them. Never have to hide his emotions from them or put on an act. It was a terrible, freeing act, their deaths, and while Izuku wanted to bawl his eyes out, show every expression of sorrow he could muster and sob into his blankets, he also just wanted to rest. He already had enough to deal with. It would be easy enough to move around. He'd practiced for this very moment, but he was also now an orphan. I'm not sure I'll be able to, he told the doctor quietly. I'm an orphan now. After I get out of the hospital, if my quirk hasn't come in, I doubt I'll be treated very well in the system. Barely anyone is, only the ones who get lucky. Besides that, my classes, music, dance, gym and coding, I've got to give it all up because those aren't free, and it's not like my fosters and group home and orphanage directors would pay for me to keep going. Being blind won't help my case either. My intelligence isn't going to do me any favors. I don't have time to be a child, sir. There's too much against me now, so why bother? Geez, Zoo, do you have to be so depressing all the time? It's like you're asking for someone to punch some positivity into you. The very familiar, very sarcastic drawl of Jiro Kyoka sounded from the doorway, and Izuku offered her a little smile. That depends. Do you have to be so sarcastic? It does nothing for your image, he retorted. Who cares about my image? I'll worry about that when I'm a goth girl in high school. She rolled her eyes. Now do you want to hear the news or not? He glanced at her curiously. What sort of news could you have for me that's good? I mean, if you haven't noticed, Izuku gestured as best he could at his body without inflicting the worst pain he'd ever known on himself. The kind that says Kyotoko and I have fostering licenses. Mika-sensei's voice joined Kyoka's. Mom, I wanted to tell him. Izuku heard Kyoka complain, but he wasn't listening anymore. His head was busy reeling from the sudden revelation and what his music teacher, one of them, anyway, was offering. It wasn't adoption, but it was a place he felt safe. Zoo, you good over there? His friend's voice snapped him out of it, and he nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm fine. Oh, by the way, I have news too. I'm fully blind. Can't see a thing. Well, actually it's like my eyes are immersed in a thick, white fog, so I guess I do see something, but otherwise. Nada. Izuku formed jazz hands carefully and smirked at his friend, and he could hear Kyoka groan, but he could also feel her smile. Does that mean we have to stop lessons? Kyotoko-sensei's voice piped in. Kyoka, Izuku and Mika-sensei all scoffed at the question. No way. If he did, who'd be there to be my rival, or mess up a song I could play in my sleep? Kyoka folded her arms. If I stopped, no one would be there to take Kyo-chan down a peg or two when she messes up a song she bets she could play without practicing. Izuku shot back. And who would be there to check on Kyo when she's playing and forgets to eat? Mika-sensei asked with a smile. He does that too, Kyoka grumbled, hiding the red flush of her ears behind her earphone jacks. Kyoka's quirk was interesting, Izuku had decided. It was a mutation quirk like her mother's, where she had detachable phone jacks on her ears. They gave her incredible hearing abilities and allowed her to project sound out as well, but she hadn't learned how to do that, yet. Izuku hadn't learned what Kyotoko-sensei's quirk was. So I'll be staying with you after the hospital? Izuku asked, a sliver of hope in his voice. If your social worker agrees to it. Mika-sensei nodded, before the conversation was interrupted by the ringtone of Mika-sensei's phone. She disappeared from the room with Kyoto-sensei in her wake, leaving Izuku and Kyoka by themselves. The doctor had slunk out of his room the first chance he'd gotten. "You're getting a brother," Izuku began. Kyoka grinned at him. "And you're getting a sister, what's up?" she asked. Izuku fidgeted in his bed, his sightless eyes dropping to his bedsheets. "You're going to be my sister and I won't be able to see you again," he replied, his voice barely audible. "Zu, you know what I look like, you don't need to see me, she smiled. A rare event for Jiro. Kyoka, at him, skipping to sit carefully by his side, taking his hand and placing her other gently on top of his. Izuku raised his head, turning his face towards her. Izuku couldn't see a thing. His imagination at work, however, could picture every single little detail about his friend. Slowly, as slowly as he could to not aggravate his injuries, Izuku raised his free hand to Kyoka's face, letting his hand run down it, his palm barely grazing her skin. People say that when you can't see, your other senses try to compensate it and you find yourself hearing better, smelling better, touch and taste increase to where you could know what someone looks like by skin contact or where a certain type of food or drink was made, but I never believed it. Do you believe in that story now? Kyoka asked, her voice gentler and softer, more compassionate than anything Izuku had heard before. The dam within him broke and Izuku found a stream of tears trailing down his cheeks as he saw Kyoka. It was nothing more than the shape of her head, her face, her smile and her hair, how tall she was and her figure. Although he didn't pay attention to her figure, he didn't care, and there wasn't any color to her, but he could see her. A black outline and a few basic details was all he had to go on, but she was there. I know you want to be a musician like Mika-sensei and Kyoto-sensei, but I think you would make a really good hero, Izuku said before he realized what he was saying. He let go of Kyoka, drawing his hands away from hers and her face, drying his eyes. Zu, we're only 5, we have time to figure out who we are and what we want to be, you know, she chuckled wetly, swiftly removing any signs of her own tears. Yeah, but I'm going to be a hero, the first blind hero. Although I'm not sure about all the attention I'd get as a spotlight hero, it just sounds like a waste of time, Izuku grumbled. What about underground heroics? Mika-sensei's voice rang out in questions. Izuku jumped, startled, before hissing in pain. Whoops, sorry Izu-kun, she apologized. Izuku shook his head. It's fine, what's underground heroics? They're a type of hero. A group of heroes who don't want to be seen or noticed by the media so they can do their jobs in as much peace as they can get. No one knows who they are, even though they're some of the best heroes out there, she explained. As she did so, Izuku found himself drawn into the idea of an unsung hero. They did their jobs well, but got no recognition for it. They weren't hounded by fans or stalked by reporters, but focused on the dirty part of heroics. The drug dealers, smugglers, yakuza, raids and investigations and in turn, got paid a turn above spotlight heroes. It was perfect for him, but could he do it? Stop overthinking. Zu, I can hear you from a mile away, Kyoka nudged him with her elbow. I wasn't, Kyo-chan. Sure, then what were you doing? She asked and got no answer in reply. Thought so, she sniggered triumphantly. You do the same thing when it comes to practice, Izuku snapped. Kyoka's grin faded into a scowl as she realized he was right and, finding no retort, she stuck her tongue out at him waiting for a retaliation. Silence fell over them before Izuku, guessing what she did, spoke up. Kyo-chan, I can't see, remember. Kyoka flinched, then snorted. This is going to be hard to get used to, isn't it? Very, Izuku nodded. Mika, did you give them the good news? Kyoto-sensei nudged her gently by the shoulder and his wife startled, shaking her head no. She turned a blinding smile on Kyoka and Izuku. The call was from your social worker, Izu-kun, it's official. Izuku and Kyoka perked up at that, Kyoka's eyes sparkling and Izuku smiling widely. The placement was approved, he asked, almost giddily. Yes, she said there would be a few home visits. Every 2 weeks for the first few months, then just once a month for the remainder of the year. After that, It should be a visit every couple of months until you become more independent. We need to warn you though, Izuku, Kyotoko and I can't press for adoption. With our work, we're gone for lengths at a time. It's been overlooked since we look after Kyoko without problems and we know you quite well, but this won't turn into an adoption. I thought we should let you know. This is a fostering. It means if people want to adopt you and your social worker approves, you'll be taken in by that family unless they rescind the adoption or are found to be unfit to be adopting. We can object, but you won't always be with us, is that okay? Mika-sensei explained to him. Izuku took in everything she had to say. It hurt to know he wouldn't have a proper family, but the Jiros were close enough to what he imagined his own family to be like. It would be okay, he thought as he nodded to Mika-sensei, he would be okay. The next few weeks were slow while Izuku recovered in the hospital. There were doctors in and out of his room, though Izuku often referred to it as a cell. The Jiros visited daily, but they could never stay long for reasons they wouldn't explain. His thoughts ran wild with nothing to do and he began to analyze. Whatever he could hear around him was profiled and analyzed. People, carts, objects, things in his room and the hallway whenever the door was left open. He had nothing else to do, so he settled for learning. Without his eyes to see, his other senses were starting to work overtime to compensate for it. His hearing was sharp, heightened, as was his touch and smell, but he wasn't allowed to walk, which meant he had no way of honing and controlling what he heard, smelt and how far he could see when he touched floors or walls. After the first week with no way of controlling his newfound ability, Izuku found that even just touching the bed allowed him access to the floor he was on. It was as if he could see the outlines of everything and everyone. The sounds hurt his ears, the antiseptic and disinfectant in the air stung his nose and skin. It got to the point, eventually, where he couldn't sleep at night due to all the goings-on around him. It was strongest during the day, Izuku noted, but it was at night when he just wanted everything to stop. He shoved his hands over his ears and curled up into a ball. The noises, outlines, smells, it was too much for him, but only he could hear what he could. He whimpered in pain, a migraine bursting through his head as he shivered and jerked, his eyes wide and staring sightlessly throughout the experience. After that growth, the doctors and people around him began to notice a change to him. Eye bags from sleepless nights fighting the unseen pain, jumpiness from surprise noises or people around him. He grew quieter in an effort to balance out the noise around him and his expressions became static, straight-faced and the Jiros noticed immediately something was wrong. It took effort to get him to tell them what was going on and even then his voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. Is this a recent development? Zu, you're serious about this? Okay Izuku, what do you think this is? They asked him all together, but Izuku only clasped his hands over his ears, whimpered and drew himself into a ball. Too loud? Mika-sensei asked in a hushed voice. Izuku nodded, but made no move to remove the hands over his ears. I hear everything, Mika-sensei. I can feel this entire floor, I can smell the floor we're on, but it feels wrong, like everything's muddled and outlines, they're clear, but the shapes are so fuzzy. It's all the same, but something's missing, out of place, like there's a piece of me not in me and I hate it, it's wrong, Izuku breathed, his voice barely audible. It started when Kyo-chan and you guys visited, that was when the outlines formed, but it got really bad recently. A couple of days ago I started hearing and feeling and smelling everything. Yesterday was when the feeling of something missing attached itself to whatever my senses are doing, he said. Kyoka, her ear right next to Izuku's mouth, diligently repeated everything Izuku said to her parents and Izuku's doctor, which had the normally cheerful man grimacing. I think this might be a sign of his quirk manifesting, but I didn't think it would be so quickly. It must be because of the rapid escalation of his sight loss. That must have sped up the process of his quirk manifesting, because the quirk didn't have to do any more work to prepare Izuku-kun's body for it. All we need to do is figure out what his quirk is. You said he felt as if something was missing, did he tell you what? The doctor asked Kyoka. She shook her head, taking on a thoughtful expression. He did say the outlines of what he sees is blurry. The outline's solid, but the shape isn't, it's fuzzy. That didn't really make much sense to me, but could it be important? The doctor smiled at Kyoka. It could be, thank Doctor. Something's going on with the patient in room 202. A nurse called frantically, rushing to where Izuku lay, writhing and spasming violently in his curled-up ball, hands over his ears and whines and whimpers escaping him. Worry filled the Jiro's faces and they ran through the hall back to Izuku's room, passing a tall blonde with greenish-yellow eyes and long hair down, a woman with a cheery smile and light pastel green hair with a bandana holding her bangs in place and a third man on crutches. He wore all black, unlike his colorful companions, with long, messy black hair, a scarf wrapped around his neck and tired golden eyes on a pale face. The three watched the commotion and the blonde raised an eyebrow in question. Wonder what's going on there, don't you, Sho? Emmy. Yeah. The green-haired woman looked on at the worried nurses, the family of three and the doctor curiously, then grinned a knowing, sly grin. Let's go see. Fukukado. You know we can't. The tired, black-haired man, the one on crutches glared at her, but she paid no mind to him and dragged him and the blonde with her. She followed the nurses at a distance with the two men in tow, coming to a room in the hallway. Inside were the family they'd seen, a doctor looking frantic and nurses all around. What's going on? The blonde spoke louder than he thought and attention in the room swung to them. Who are you? You can't be here, the doctor demanded with a glare. The tired man directed an utterly exhausted look at the doctor, pulling out his wallet and hero license. I'm Pro-Hero Eraserhead. My companions are known as Present Mike and Ms. Joke, he said in a drawl. To his surprise, instead of looking suspicious of them, the doctor's expression changed to relief. Eraserhead. The man breathed. Please, we need your help, and he, the family, although they looked scared and confused, and the nurses moved away from the bed. The patient was a young boy, perhaps 4 or 5 from the looks of it, curled into himself in a tight ball, his body jerking and writhing in pain. His hands were clasped tightly over his ears and the quiet whimpers and sobs of pain leaving the boy's throat cracked Eraserhead's tough heart. The boy was incredibly young, too young to be in so much pain. His head was filled with fluffy green curls cut short to examine head damage most likely. There were casts and bandages on all his limbs and bruises over the parts that weren't either covered in bandages and casts or the hospital gown, which didn't cover as much as it looked it would. His skin was a fair, light white and his eyes, from what Eraserhead could see, were a dim emerald green, as if someone had beat the sight from vibrant green eyes. What's wrong with him? Eraserhead kept his voice light and quiet, but even that brought a flinch from the boy. He raised his head to look at Eraserhead, his eyebrows crinkled in pain and his mouth pursed tightly shut. Who are you? He asked croakily, his throat hoarse. My name is Aizawa Shota. I'm a pro-hero by the name of Eraserhead. Who are you? Midoriya Izuku. The boy took a shuddering breath. Don't know you. Who are you? My name is Aizawa Shota, Midoriya Izuku. Izuku. Please, Izuku interrupted, his voice as quiet as ever, but just a little louder. Okay, Izuku, can you tell me what's wrong? Too loud, too smelly, too much, and it's all still wrong. The boy swiped at his ears and his nose, his voice cracking on the last part of his sentence. Aizawa nodded as if he understood, moving to stand in front of Izuku. He crouched down so he was at eye level with him. Can you tell me what's wrong? Something missing. Can you tell me what? Izuku started to shake his head, then paused, frowning and a bead of sweat formed on his eyebrows. Water. Cool, soft, it tickles, earth, I think. He replied unsurely, his eyes fixed on Aizawa. The young hero tried to stop himself from shifting uncomfortably in the face of pale emerald green, unblinking eyes as he nodded again. Okay, do you need the earth or? I don't care. No. Izuku cried, I don't know. It started happening a couple weeks ago, but it got really bad a few days ago, and then I start getting this feeling something's wrong, that something's missing and now I want to touch the ground. Feel the earth beneath my feet. Feel something, okay. Okay, Izuku, we got it, we'll be right back, okay. Aizawa stood up when he got a confirming nod from Izuku, gesturing for everyone to leave the hospital room. What is it? What's wrong with the boy? Ms. Joke asked eagerly. Aizawa glared at her. I'm guessing this is a quirk-related matter. The doctor nodded quickly. His quirk is unlike anything we've seen before. It's a sensory emitter elemental quirk that also has a mutant variant that affects his eyesight. He's blind, can't see a thing, but he can, now. What we're worried about is that everything's been thrown out of the timeline. He wasn't supposed to go blind yet, he still had between a year and 2. It was a car crash that took away the rest of his already fading sight. His quirk was adjusting his body to fit in it and would only appear once he'd settled into full blindness, about a year afterwards. The car crash, Izuku-kun going blind so fast, the quirk coming in even faster, this was all unpredicted. Because the quirk could come in without doing any of the fixing of his eyes, it's stronger, coming in faster than we anticipated, and we aren't equipped to handle him. Even worse, we don't know what type of element he can manipulate. We've ruled out fire and water. Wind's practically out at this point too, so it has to be earth, but it's an earth type. You're right on that, Aizawa interrupted the frazzled doctor, who'd almost started pacing during his explanation. Excuse me, but how do you know? Can you help him? A woman with shoulder-length purple hair asked, her husband and daughter, it seemed, encompassing her. Can you help, Zu? The little girl demanded. Aizawa smirked into his scarf. I think so, kid, I think so. Aizawa turned to the doctor. He said he felt something missing, that something was wrong. He insisted on it, actually, quite strongly in fact. He then described to me what he felt was missing, said something told him what was missing, but he was pretty incoherent about it, like he didn't know himself. He said it felt wet and cool, like water, but not. He mentioned earth, needing to feel it on his feet, his body, said it was soft, and that it tickled. Can we do anything with that information? Aizawa asked as he turned to face the doctor once more. The doctor nodded slowly, processing the onslaught of new information. Yes, we should be able to with that, but could you relieve him of his pain, even a little? Give him some comfort while we try to sort this out for him. The doctor was almost begging as he requested Aizawa's help. Fukukado, Ms. Joken, Zashi, Present Mike, weren't helping. They were, annoyingly enough, nodding along and offering his help for him. He couldn't say no to a problem child in the making, though, so he sighed, put all thoughts of a nap away in his mind and strode into Izuku's room, sitting cautiously on his bed and taking one of Izuku's hands. The boy flinched violently, but he relaxed somewhat when he realized Aizawa's hold was gentle, not meant to harm or hurt. You're back, he whispered quietly. I said I would be, didn't I? I thought you were lying, he admitted. Well, I'm right here and I have something we could try, is that okay? He asked. Izuku paused, wary eyes landing, unseeingly, on him cautiously, before the boy nodded. Aizawa took a deep breath, then let his quirk flash on Izuku and the boy gasped, flinching away from Aizawa, shocked. What did you do? He questioned Aizawa, who let go of his quirk. Izuku flinched more violently, his eyes never leaving Aizawa. You made the pain go away, he whispered, almost reverently to Aizawa. You took my pain away. Only for a minute, kid. It's not permanent, but you made me not hurt. I did, was it okay? Izuku nodded as fast he could, latching onto the hero. It was amazing. I was hurting, it was everything at once and you made it stop. It went away and everything was quiet. Thank you, hero. Izuku's volume dropped to a bare whisper further into his speech. It was Aizawa's turn to look shocked when the boy called him hero. Thanks, kid. I actually came here with some of my friends, want to meet them. I'll use my quirk again on you, they're quite loud so it could be tricky as you are, he offered. Izuku paused, tilting his head to the side as though he was pondering his situation, then nodded shyly. Yes, please, he replied. Aizawa hid a grin. Zashi and Fukukado would love him, he knew it. Zashi because the boy was cute in his eyes and Fukukado because Izuku was as straight-faced as he was. Izuku nodded silently to Aizawa, indicating he was ready. He straightened his face out to his usual blankness and Aizawa activated his quirk, calling to present Mike and Ms. Joke. "You're free to enter," he said simply, and just like that, the doors to Izuku's hospital room were thrown wide open. "Is this him? Show. He's cuter than the last time we saw him," Mike screeched excitedly. "He is indeed. Shota, let's have our own baby. For the last time. Joke, I'm marrying Zashi." "Stop being a pain," the erasure hero groaned, keeping his wide-open eyes and Quirk on Izuku. The boy in question stared at the two new heroes, then let his sightless eyes drift over to Aizawa. One eyebrow rose in incredulous question, and Aizawa didn't bother to hide the snort of amusement that left his lips. "Yes, problem child, they're always like this. The annoying woman is Fukukado Emi, an underground hero by the name of Ms. Joke. Next to that disgrace of a hero is my loudmouth partner and soon-to-be husband, Yamada Hazashi, or present Mike, if you prefer his hero name." "Ah, come on, show, we aren't that bad," the voice hero complained childishly. "Where's your sense of humor gone, Mr. Grumpy Pants?" Joke asked Aizawa with a cheeky smirk. 6 feet under, Izuku responded in perfect deadpan, before Aizawa could, and all eyes turned to him in disbelief, before Joke burst out laughing. "Oh gosh, Shota, where did you find this kid? He's a riot," she wheezed. Izuku gave her an unimpressed look. "I thought underground heroes were supposed to take their jobs seriously. What happened to you?" "Love," she replied immediately, and Aizawa groaned. "For the last time, no one here is in love with you," Aizawa ground out, the hero's attitude grinding his nerves and whatever lick of patience he had to dust. "Lighten up, Eraser," Ms. Joke grinned. She then turned to Izuku and her smile softened. "Not everyone can be as stoic and serious as Eraser, kid. Especially with the variety of quirks out here in the world. Mine relies on making people laugh. What better way to make someone laugh than bad jokes?" she asked. Izuku pursed his lips, pondering the thought. "That still doesn't explain why you have to fight with Rubber Chicken." Weighted Rubber Chicken, Shota, weighted. They deal some damage. Not too much, but I can still slay." She posed for dramatic effect. Aizawa and Izuku both gave twin sighs and shook their heads while present Mike laughed and grinned at her antics. Somehow, Izuku could see the two rambunctious heroes being good friends. "Sorry to cut this short, Izuku, but my quirk's not meant to be used for so long," Aizawa grimaced, straining his eyes to keep his quirk active. Izuku shook his head, his blank expression fading the slightest amount. "It's okay, your quirk could strain your eyes if you aren't careful. Just please be quiet when my quirk's active again, the noise hurts like nothing you'd ever believe," he told Aizawa simply. The three heroes nodded and Izuku once again covered his ears with his hands, allowing Aizawa to let go of his quirk. Present Mike, Ms. Joke and Eraserhead all hurried out of his room quickly and quietly as Izuku went back to flinching and whimpering in pain. Aizawa paused at the doorway, glancing back at the kid on the bed. He was a problem child for certain, but one day, he would make a brilliant hero. That, Aizawa knew for certain. Chapter text. A month and a half. It took a month and a half for Izuku's injuries to heal enough that he could leave the hospital, and even though he'd gotten used to his senses being amplified, nothing could have prepared him for the sensation of finally stepping foot on soil. The hospital hadn't been too bad. Just loud and noisy with way too many people and way too much disinfectant. The earth, the soil, it was cool beneath his bare feet. It was calm and cool and attuned his senses, as if he was connected with the earth, as if he was an extension of it. Unbidden, memories the earth had carried with it flowed into his mind, and Izuku took a shuddering breath, releasing it and closing his eyes. He knew the Jiros, who signed him out of the hospital, were behind him. Ms. Joke, Present Mike and Eraserhead were, too. Ms. Joke, it seemed, had made it her life's work to make him laugh, or at least smile. Izuku was sure she'd start trying to get him to call her Mom, just like she kept asking Eraserhead to marry her. Izuku refused resolutely every time, but he had progressed to using her name, at least. Present Mike was insistent that Izuku call him Uncle Zashi, and Eraserhead, Uncle Shota. Aizawa had no trouble being called that, and so Izuku agreed, though Present Mike was still Hazashi-san. His excuse was that he knew Shota better than Hazashi or Fukukado, but it was really that he enjoyed messing with the man. Kyoka saw through him in an instant. It was still funny, though. Izuku's brief memories of his brief stay in the hospital fled in mind and were replaced with memories of old, memories that had been stored in the ground and the soil and the deepest parts of the earth. It was more of a story of elemental quirk users, but they weren't quirks. Elemental powers gifted to those who studied the ways of old, each elemental style based off of a martial arts. He saw a young boy, 12 years of age, practicing circular walking and a palm-style fighting method for air manipulation, airbending, it was called. There was a girl, practicing Tai Chi and manipulating water from streams and even from her gourd water bottle. That was waterbending, Izuku mused. Next was fire. A boy older than the girl and other boy was practicing kung fu. This one, Izuku knew, was a northern Shaolin style and firebending. That had to be the proper calling of the fighting style. He'd had the chance to read up about kung fu styles, even if kids his age shouldn't be reading stuff like that. The last figure was two figures, which confused Izuku greatly. They seemed to also be a style of kung fu, but unlike the previous firebender, the two different styles the two different people used differed. One of the figures was a man, a tall, muscular, broad-shouldered man wearing long, flowing pants cinched at the ankles and waist and a tight-fitting, sleeveless shirt tucked into his pants. His kung fu style was heavy, based on the man's obvious physical strength and using his weight and solidity to push at the ground, command it with strength like a wild animal. That wasn't an option for him. He would never be so built and he could train for strength, but his slight, slim build and short height, plus his blindness, wasn't suited for such a heavy, forceful style. The other figure, on the other hand, was a girl, years older than him, but with his build, slight stature and short height. She was using the same earthbending style as the man and it wasn't any more elegant, but it was a lot more fluid, a lot easier to connect blow to blow. The style focused on low to the ground ankle kicks using the earth to target her opponent and elbows and hands to direct strikes, much like a praying mantis. The girl kept her hands out and open, as if she was holding a giant book in the air. From there she struck, using whatever part of the arms she needed. Forearm, upper arm, fingers, hands, even her shoulders, she used it all. Her stance was a lot more upright than the man's, which allowed for greater circular stepping motions. Izuku noticed she kept her stance wider than shoulder width, which was proper for a fighting style, and that she kept her eyes open. She's different, Izuku muttered to himself, unknowingly out loud. The 6 onlookers watched with puzzled expressions as Izuku stood on the earth of a park just across the road from the hospital. He's just been standing there, should we be worried about his sanity? Fukukado joked. Mika sent her a glare and the laughter hero shrugged, smiling back. Izuku paid them no mind, studying the girl's forms and fighting style as she battled. She faced all kinds of opponents, old, young, men, women, and she beat them all easily. Her feet were flat on the ground most of the time, but she was up on the balls of her feet when she faced an opponent or moved into her stances. They were usually wide with her feet turned in so the outlines were straight. She used chops and strikes to direct earth, her knuckles and fingers as well, for quicker attacks and blocks. She used her elbows primarily for deconstructing and breaking walls that were far too solid to be dirt or wood and her large knuckles and the backs of her hands for smaller blockades and structures. Izuku watched the girl, fascinated with the way she moved, the way she fought, the way she thought. He noted down her appearance and method of dress, her hairstyle and footwear, before he noticed she never wore anything on her feet. Izuku's expression narrowed in suspicion and his eyes focused on her face, or rather, her eyes. They were the same type of lightened emerald green, as if they'd been replaced by mist or had the light beeped out of them. She's blind, he whispered. She was a slightly built, blind girl, that's why her earthbending style was different from the man's. She couldn't use the general power, strength type. She didn't have the body for it, she was small so strength wouldn't do her any good and she was blind, which meant, if he was right, she could use the earth around her, vibrations of objects and people around her, to determine their locations, how they fought, where their weak points were. She used something he could learn to do himself and he didn't even need a physical teacher. Quickly, Izuku opened his eyes again and turned back to the Jiros and the 3 heroes. not exactly grinning. He did his best to keep his face neutral, but his eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'm an earthbender," he said bluntly. "Okay, and what's an earthbender?" Kyoka asked with a confused stare at Izuku. "Someone like me, someone who can use the earth around them, manipulate it into shapes. And there are others, other elemental benders, one's part of the 4 cardinal elements. I saw it all, the earth showed me." The adults around him stared at him, uncomprehending. "Zoo, what the hell?" Kyoka asked him, unimpressed. Izuku deflated, the shine leaving his eyes. "Do you need an explanation, or?" He left the question hanging in the air and the adults quickly nodded. Izuku sat down on the grassy earth of the park and waited for the others and Kyoka to do the same. As they settled around Izuku, he prepared his mind to tell the story he read from the earth around him. "So, care to tell us what this is all about?" Aizawa asked, a tired sigh leaving his lips. "Yeah, wanna explain why you think you're some crazy elementalist quirk wielder?" Kyoka chimed in with a glare in Izuku's direction. "The earth told me, I read its memories, sort of." "You read the earth's memories?" Kyoto stared at him blankly. That made Izuku groan. "Yes, I read the earth's memories. From what I could understand, elemental benders existed a millennia ago, manipulators of the 4 cardinal elements. You know what those are, right?" "Water, wind, fire and earth," Hisashi replied. Izuku nodded. "Right. Back then, everything was imbued with or had the attribute of the 4 cardinal elements." "Everything." Mika's eyes widened. Some were clear on attributes, like heat and volcanoes, and the sun were fire attributed, and as its opposite, waterfalls, brooks and streams, and the moon were water attributed. Air attributes were wind and the sky, while earth attributes were all around us, grass, ground, plants and the stars. Animals had attributes too, wind, water, fire, earth. They were the 4 elements that controlled nature. Humans were born and raised with respect of these elements, great respect, and they soon found themselves the masters of the elements literally. Those who could control the elements were called elemental benders, and each bender was attributed to an element, but to control those elements, something else was necessary, control over the mind, body and spirit, and so elemental benders also turned into martial artists. There was a different martial art for each element. Waterbenders used Tai Chi, for its fluid and smoothness from blow to blow, just as water was. Firebenders used the northern Shaolin style of Kung Fu for its strong arm and leg movements. Airbenders practiced Bagua, which is a lot of powerful circular movements, and earthbenders used Hungar, a style that found its root in the animals of the wild. These martial arts helped expand and grow the world of elemental bending, until the benders split apart, separated. "Why'd they do that?" Kyoka asked eagerly. "The firebenders believed strength reigned over everything, the airbenders thought freedom would be found away from worldly problems, earthbenders wanted to defend themselves first and foremost, and the waterbenders hid to protect themselves from a great catastrophe they had warned the other benders of, but the elements were never meant to be apart from each other. The 4 elements of nature had a bond and pact stronger than the warrings among humans like us, and so the Avatar was born. The Avatar was a bender chosen by the sacred elements to learn and connect the elements together as they once were. Unlike normal benders, who could only use the bending style of their elemental attribute, the Avatar had the potential to learn and bend all 4 of the elements. "I guess that's where connect the 4 elements comes from," Hisashi tried. The joke fell flat and Izuku continued his tale. The Avatar was always chosen in a pattern, once every 100 years, and one from every clan of benders in a pattern. Fire, water, air, earth. Fire, water, air, earth, the cycle continued. The Avatar once more joined together the 4 nations and the 4 elements, but the Fire Nation grew greedy. They gathered their armies, their benders and soldiers, and attacked the Avatar and the other benders, forcing them to bow to the will of the fire element. The emperor of the Fire Nation at the time was pleased at his conquest, which of course was when the prophecy was delivered to him. The Avatar of air would be the downfall of the Fire Nation. The emperor became mad, furious, and attacked the air nomads, leaving the Avatar cycle broken and the airbenders lost to the wind, or so it was thought. "Seriously," Kyoka complained, eagerly hooked on the story. The adults seemed to be a little more skeptical than the 5-year-old girl, but they listened quietly as his story went on. 100 years passed and the elemental benders of the water and earth attributes were weakening and losing strength, but a young girl, the only waterbender of a small waterbending tribe, Katara, and her brother, the mighty warrior Sokka, found the Avatar frozen in the southern seas. Aang, the last airbender in the Avatar, along with his waterbending master Katara, Sokka the warrior, the blind master earthbender Toph Beifong, and the exiled and traitor Prince Zuko of the Fire Nation traveled the four elemental nations in search of what being an elemental bender truly meant and banded together to defeat Zuko's elder sister, the talented princess of the Fire Nation, and their father, the Emperor. Peace was brought back to the world, but the world of elemental bending was already coming to a close. The elemental benders were lost to history as the modern times arose, and centuries after that came the era of quirks, our era. Does that explain much? Oh yes, more than needed, Izuku. Why, after that lengthy explanation, do you believe yourself to be an earthbender? According to you, well, the earth, they died out a millennia ago. That's 1,000 years, problem child, Aizawa groaned. Well, I'm not a real earthbender, as you said, they died out 1,000 years ago. So far, I'm the closest thing to one the earth has ever seen, apparently. I have ties, connections to the earth, and I bet you that there are others. Others like me, who have seemingly straightforward elemental powers, simple water or wind or fire manipulation, but with the right nudge, the right style of fighting, they could become something akin to the elemental benders of old, Izuku replied, the shine of excitement gleaming in his eyes. And you know this style, the one you need to learn in order to manipulate the ground in such a way you'd be recognized as an earthbender. Ms. Joke, who'd stayed silent as a grave throughout Izuku's explanation, raised her voice. That's actually a little complicated. Izuku winced at the question in his voice. That caused Aizawa to groan again, and he was sure the older man was contemplating what his life would be like without problem children, as Aizawa put it. What do you mean, Izu-kun? Mika asked carefully, her eyes full of worry. It's nothing dangerous, I promise, but the style of earthbending the average earthbender uses won't help me at all. That style was made for power and physicality, not for someone like me, with a slimmer build and slighter, shorter stature. That's why I want to study Toph Beifong. Who now? Hizashi questioned confusedly, rubbing his temple. Toph Beifong. She taught the last Avatar to earthbend. I was hoping she could teach me. How? Aizawa demanded. Izuku shrunk in on himself, drawing circles in the dirt with his finger nervously. By reading the earth and copying what she's doing. That earned him his third groan of the afternoon, and Izuku felt bad for his uncle Shota, wishing he could stop traumatizing the man. Please, I know what I'm doing, slightly, I can manage, I think. Izuku's reassurances weren't all that reassuring. That is cool and stupid at the same time, Kyoka grumbled at the end of his story. I know, Kyo-chan, but I can do it, I can copy her movements and learn how to fight from her. And I'll be at an advantage, because people won't know how to counter me. Toph's fighting style is aggressive and active, but it's also a perfect fit for someone like her, like me. The best part about it is that even without my quirk, even if someone like Uncle Shota takes it away, I can still fight. Earthbending and the bending styles center elements around martial arts, not martial arts around quirks, and that means I can use it both far away, with my quirk, and close combat, with the martial arts. I know I can do it, I promise I can. The adults, the sensible ones, glanced at each other, unsure of what to do. Fukukado, Hizashi and Kyotoko, all inspired by Izuku's great speech, nodded agreement enthusiastically, turning pleading eyes on Mika, Aizawa and Kyoka. The little girl scowled at her father and the other two sentimental saps. You'll be safe? Mika asked. Probably. You will be safe, problem child. Aizawa said, and this time it wasn't a question. You won't make me pull out for a broken bone or bruises, will you? Not for minor injuries like that, but anything too dangerous, and we'll stop these experimental training sessions in their tracks, understand? Yes, sir, I promise. Izuku nodded seriously. He knew his uncle Shota took nothing more seriously than personal safety and safety while training. If Izuku returned with more than bruises or scrapes more often than Shota deemed appropriate, he wouldn't be allowed to train until his uncle and Mika were certain he was safe. You'll also have at least one supervisor with every training period. Either me, Zashi or Fukukado will be with you. You train without supervision and you spend a month training under me, understand? Izuku shivered at the threat and nodded quickly. He liked Aizawa, liked him very much, but from what he'd heard, the man was utterly ruthless when it came to punishment training. I'll take care of myself and follow all of the rules. Uncle Shota, can we go home now, Auntie Mika? He turned to the Jiros. Mika smiled and nodded and she took Kyotoko by the arm, leading him and Kyoka away from the park and hospital with the three heroes calling out their goodbyes. He hoped, for a reason unknown to him, that the Jiros were his ticket to the fresh start they seemed to always promise to him. All right Izuku, welcome to your new home, Kyotoko grinned as he held the car door open for him. Izuku glanced at Kyotoko, puzzled, but not having a direct connection with the ground, with the earth dulled his senses majorly. He could still see and hear at above average rates, but outlines of objects were vague and blurry. It got better once he left the car and got his feet on the ground. It was strange, as if he could feel his connection to the earth running through his body like an electrical charge, and it was as if that charge was doused whenever he left the ground. Ever since he first left the hospital, the first time he set foot on the grassy earth of the park, his feet bare and devoid of protection, it was as if all the noise he heard, the people he felt and the smells he smelled all dulled away and were wholly controllable in every way through the earth. His very first connection to the ground allowed him control over everything he could do with the ground, that included his senses. It also meant he could earthbend, or close enough to it to resemble earthbending. It also meant he could read the memories of the earth to watch Toph fight and live and maybe learn a thing or two from her that didn't involve fighting or martial arts in the slightest. As wrapped up in his thoughts and feelings as he was, he still managed to follow the Jiros inside the house. It was the same, mostly immaculate space he'd gotten used to over the past year from his music classes. He wondered if he'd be all right to keep playing, but if he could see the outline of the instruments, he should be okay. He memorized every aspect of each instrument he played exactly for a situation just like this one. Since you know what most of the bottom half of the house looks like, we'll skip the tour straight through to your surprise. Izuku blinked himself out of his thoughts, staring at Kyotoko, Mika and Kyoka. My what? He asked bluntly. Kyoka snorted, elegance at its finest. What did you think we were doing while you were sleeping your days away? Work, music, daycare. Izuku shrugged with his answer, still a little baffled at the fact they'd prepared something for him. It's not much, but we wanted you to feel at home. You've never been upstairs, have you? Kyotoko asked him gently. Izuku shrugged again, only to Kyo-chan's room, other than that, I stayed downstairs. Kyoka blushed lightly as her parents turned smirks on their daughter. I just wanted to show him my stuff, she muttered. Izuku nodded agreement. There were a lot of instruments, I thought it was cool, he said. Kyoka blushed harder, spearing him lightly with one of her earphone jacks to get him to shut up. Izuku flinched at the sudden pain, but otherwise said nothing. All right then, Mika grinned, I think you'll like this. She led her family plus Izuku up the stairs that led to the second floor. Unlike the first floor, which held the family and living rooms, the second floor was lined with cupboards and closets and rooms, most of which were for storage. There was a bathroom and plenty of instruments lining the hallways, but Izuku paid little mind to it. He'd seen a lot of the second floor when Kyoka brought him to her room to show him things. It was a cute room, purple and black in color and fairly neat, as well as full of instruments. He wondered what they were doing up on the second floor, unless... Izuku. Mika called him out of his thoughts. Welcome to your room. She opened a door on the right, not too far from the stairs, but not close either. Izuku stared out at the Jiros, even as they grinned at him, waiting for him to take the first steps into his own space. He stepped inside carefully, a little awed and happy that they'd go out of their way to accommodate him. The little room was neat, a good-sized bed tucked away in the far right corner. 2 windows spanned the back wall by the bed. In the opposite corner was a desk and chair piled with books on braille and books with it so he could read and study. Apart from those few things, instruments lined the walls. His flute, guitar, violin and a whole slew of other instruments Izuku wanted to try, but never had the time to, hung on the left and right walls. As Izuku gazed about his bedroom, he spotted his 2 Quirk analysis notebooks and he smiled. Izuku turned back to the Jiros and offered them a warm smile. "Thank you so much," he said, "it's perfect." "Thank goodness," Kyotoko sighed in relief. "He was worried you wouldn't like it," Mika added, while her husband blustered. The 2 adults bickered good-naturedly with each other as Kyoka approached Izuku, who was admiring the brilliant shine of his new instruments. "You like them? They're amazing. I hoped you would. You're always saying you want to learn more, now you can." "The question now is which one to start with," Izuku chuckled. "I'd recommend the cello, oboe or clarinet. They're the most similar to what you started with, so they should be relatively simple, though that does mean more theory work," Kyoka sniggered. "With Quirk practice and music lessons, will I even be able to fit in dance and gymnastics?" Izuku wondered out loud. "Don't forget your studies," Mika interrupted loudly. "I won't, but those don't really start until we turn 7, so it's not a big deal." Izuku shrugged. Mika frowned. "That's another issue. Izuku, you do go to a daycare, right?" Izuku nodded. "I do, but I don't like it there. Everyone's mean and make fun of me because of my eyes," he explained. He had been pulled out of daycare for the past 2 months due to the crash and his injuries, so no one knew about his quirk, but he didn't want anyone to know, specifically Marana Eureka, Asano Itsumi, Kiriko Kamiho and his old friend Bakugo Katsuki. Marana Eureka was about his height with light skin, freckles around her nose and short orange-yellow hair. She'd gotten her quirk a month or so after Bakugo and it was impressive. Not quite as impressive as explosions were, but conjuring glowing balls of light she could manipulate to her will was cool in its own way. She'd called it Sunlit Orb, after much deliberation. Asano Itsumi's quirk came in about a week after several other kids got their quirks. He was a bit on the tall side, lean with a slim build, pale skin and light blonde hair. His quirk was called Papercraft and it allowed him total control over anything that could be classified as paper. It meant he could reinforce paper to make it as sharp as steel and hard as iron. It also meant a lot of paper cuts for Izuku wherever they were paired together for activities. Finally Kirito Kamiho. His was one of the last quirks to come in, barring Izuku. He contrasted Asano almost perfectly with a short, stocky body, dark olive skin and raven black hair. Where Asano looked apathetic to everything, Kamiho carried a leer that never seemed to leave his face. He'd called his quirk Shift, simply because that's what he did. It used his own energy and stamina to transform himself into anything he knew the name of. He couldn't shift into another person, but he knew plenty of animals, plants and objects. His 3 bullies still worshipped the ground Katsuki walked on, but he'd also started to take note of them, marking them down as potential rivals, though he scoffed at the paper manipulation quirk and that made all 3 of them angry. He won the resulting fight, but with a lot more scratches and scrapes than he was used to. He kept his mouth mostly shut about their quirks after that. Izuku was the only one who hadn't gotten his quirk yet. That was one strike for social outcast. He was also smart and preferred studying and reading to playing. That was strike 2, and for the final strike, he wasn't afraid to speak his mind, but emotions were rarely seen on his face. The other kids didn't like him in the slightest and he felt the same about them. They all wanted to be heroes, yet none of them acted as heroes should. They were all bullies and arrogant narcissists. So they had strong quirks. What was a strong quirk without a likable personality? "We could put you in the same daycare we have Kyoka attend, or do you want to be pulled out completely? We know you're smart enough to not need it," Kyotoko mused seriously. Mika hummed in agreement, but Kyoka pouted. "How come he doesn't need to go? I don't need it, either," she whined. "Kyoka, this is essentially preparation for elementary. We're pulling you out next year to focus on family time before you 2 start school and we have to take longer work trips, do you understand? Izuku doesn't need it. He's already at an acceptable level for elementary school." "I am?" Izuku asked uncertainly. Kyotoko snorted. "Kid, I doubt you realize just how smart you really are." He grinned and ruffled Izuku's hair. "I know I'm smart. The other kids hate me for it, he protested. You are very self-aware for a 5-year-old, Kyoto replied with an incredulous shake of his head. Mika laughed, amused. I thought you realized that back when he first started bandying words with our little Kyo-chan. What about dance class and gymnastics? Izuku piped up suddenly, interrupting Mika's teasing of her husband. The two adults paused in their discussion and hesitated. He'd just gotten out of the hospital, he needed more time to rest up and heal. Not go gallivanting about in classes he thought he was ready to take, then collapse in on himself. A nagging voice in the back of her mind raged about, not wanting Izuku to go in and screw himself up even more, but surely the boy knew what he was doing, right? He knew the state of his body even better than she did, he had to be fine if he was requesting lessons again, right? Do you think you'll be okay to resume your lessons? Mika asked kindly. Izuku nodded resolutely. His sensing abilities were lessened indoors, but they were still good enough that he could go back to the classes he loved, rather than the bully-frequented daycare he'd been forced to attend. Mika sighed, not pleased with the decision, but all right with it. We'll talk to your teachers, she said reluctantly. She knew Izuku had his dream, but she wished he'd slow down just a little. Izuku took things at his own pace more often than not, but his pace was fast, with no room for rest and relaxation. It was like every moment in the little boy's life was meant for activities to help him become a hero faster. At the rate Izuku was traveling, he'd burn out before he reached his teen years. She hoped he'd slow down, hoped he'd take things easy, particularly with his quirk. He'd only had it for a few months and yet he already knew exactly how he wanted to use it and how to train it. There were so many things in his life that he could do, things he could explore, but she knew he'd blow right past them if they didn't have anything to do with his goal, friendships included. Mika guessed she should be lucky he found her, Kyoka and Kyoto, otherwise he'd have gotten stuck with a foster family and no hope of adoption with the way he acted. All she could do, however, was pray Izuku slowed down and made time for other things. He was smart, exceptionally so, and kind and sincere, and he knew that. So Mika could only hope Izuku knew what he was doing. Thanks Auntie Mika, it means a lot, Izuku replied quietly. He turned to Kyoto and said the same thing and they both smiled warmly. Even if they couldn't adopt, even if it seemed like Izuku wasn't taking care of himself, even if Kyoka threw up a fuss doubtful, she loved Izuku as a brother just as they loved him as a son. Izuku was well on his way to becoming a member of the Jiro family, and none of them ever wanted it to end. Chapter text. 5 years, Izuku thought, snuggling deeper into his blanket, 5 years living with the Jiros. He was 10, now, he was 10 and not much had changed since his first day out of the hospital. The Jiros loved him like he was their own. Kyoto and Mika were amazing and Kyoka was the closest to a sister he'd ever had and it was amazing. Ever since the hospital, the Jiros had looked out for him, helping and encouraging him the entire time. All his projects, gymnastics, dance, music, they'd let him do it all without complaint. His bond with the 3 heroes had grown deeper, too. Uncle Shota and Uncle Zashi had gotten married a couple years ago and although the grumpy, underground hero acted as if his husband was the most annoying man he'd met, he knew he loved the other dearly. Aunt Emmy was another factor in his life. Izuku's emotions were still as blandly shown on his face as ever and Aunt Emmy seemed to make it her personal mission to make him smile or laugh. She never succeeded, but she still kept trying. Izuku admired the woman, how cheerful she was and how much fun she seemed to have, the way she loved tormenting him and Uncle Shota with her personality and the way she never took things seriously until she did. Izuku sighed, shaking his head. That was one side of Aunt Emmy he never wanted to see again, though it was his fault to begin with. True to their word, the 3 heroes allowed Izuku to start training his quirk and always, one of the 3 was with him. They all taught him something different, from Uncle Shota's situational awareness and close combat drills to Aunt Emmy's tactics of unorthodox surprise and shock and awe to Uncle Zashi's quirk control and precision. He loved learning from them, but he loved training with his quirk the most. His earth manipulation quirk, he'd come to realize early on, was one crazy powerful quirk. There wasn't anything he couldn't do with the earth if he willed it hard enough and the earthbending style came so naturally to him, it was as if he'd been born to be an earthbender. Toph's bending style suited him perfectly, and soon he was adding his own little twists and turns to her moves, improving them and changing them so he could use them just as she could. It amazed Izuku every time he watched the girl fight. She was so strong and stubborn, with a sarcastic wit and dry humor. If he didn't like talking and socializing as much as he did, he'd give her mode of human interaction a try. As he looked deeper into the Earth's memories, he realized that Toph was so similar to him in a lot of ways. She had the same overbearing parents he did, the ones that always contained and suffocated her in the name of safety. She came from a rich household that allowed her great access to the world around her, but she was alone. She never had a real friend or a support group until Aang, Sokka and Katara broke into her house to convince her to join them. In a lot of ways, Toph reminded Izuku of himself, even if his sister was his only friend. Jiro Kyoka was, perhaps, the greatest sister and best friend he could have ever asked for. She was always there for him when he needed her, she looked out for him and always seemed to know when he was in a mood, she called it. Izuku chuckled fondly at the many memories he'd gained of his Kyo-chan. She was all scowls and rudeness to other people, but to him, smirks and sarcasm, she was the best. Kyoka was brash and headstrong. She had her own opinions and wasn't afraid to let people know what she thought, as demonstrated numerous times in the past to their homeroom elementary teacher. She was fierce, especially towards anyone who showed hostility or anything remotely resembling disgust or pity directed at him. Even if she didn't have an offensive quirk, her attitude and personality was still tough and brave enough that other kids left the both of them alone. She protected him from a lot of people who wanted to put him down and, in turn, he did the same to her. There were some people that, even with all her skills, Kyoka could just not face, and so, Izuku did it for her. He faced down everyone she couldn't, defended his sister from the people she wasn't a match for, and protected her from any harm those around them wished to cause her. And oh, elementary school was a thing. He'd been moved from the daycare he'd attended when his parents were still alive and was put into elementary school at 7, the same one Kyoka was supposed to attend. It was a private school, exclusive and on the outer perimeter of the Musudafu district. It was a good school and it was affiliated with an equally exclusive and private middle school. The rules were strict and the children high of status. That meant uptight and stuffy children from rich families from the support industry, business and heroics. The hero children were the worst of the lot, stuck up and always thinking they were better than everyone else. They had powerful quirks and steadfast dreams of being heroes just like their parents, but they were nothing more than bullies, just like Bakugo. He wasn't quite sure what happened to his old childhood friend, but from what he'd heard, he was attending Aldera Elementary. It was a crappy school full of mediocre teachers and worse students. No matter how much the students at his school hated him, they could never do anything to him. The teachers didn't allow bullying or discrimination, and even if the teachers missed some of it, Izuku had just as powerful a quirk as they did, not to mention Kyoka's earphone jacks hurt a whole hell of a lot if stabbed by them. It didn't matter if the other kids went after him or Kyoka, they never succeeded. Toph's aggressive and fast-paced earthbending style, while perfect for him, still had some limitations. The style Toph used focused more on the fact that Toph's sight required her to have her bare feet on the ground as often as possible, as she could feel and interpret the vibrations sent into the earth through the movement and positioning of people and objects back into sight, allowing her, a blind girl, to see. His quirk didn't need him to do that. As long as he was near the earth or ground, or directly above or beside it, he could still functionally see. That allowed him to fit a little more flexibility and creativity into his earthbending and fighting style. Front flips, backflips, somersaults, high kicks, knees and handstands, they could all be fit into his fighting style and direct his quirk. Earthbending was, as he'd already stated, an overpowered quirk. He could directly manipulate the earth in whatever way he willed it, and his control had grown immensely since he was 5. Under the careful and watchful eyes of Aunt Emmy, Uncle Shota and Uncle Zashi, he practiced control and precision with his earth, bending and molding it into different shapes and figurines. The first time he tried, he couldn't do anything that weren't circles or ovals. As his control increased, that limit extended to squares and hearts, growing into the incredibly detailed precision control he boasted now. More often than not, he used his quirk like Toph used her earthbending, with some minor and major differences alike. He was a lot more versatile in his use with his quirk, but every bit as aggressive and ruthless in fights as Toph was. Speaking of his aunt and uncles, he'd grown close to all three of them, a lot more than he or Uncle Shota cared to admit. Each of them brought a different, colorful aspect to his once dull life. Uncle Zashi lit up his world with bright cheer and optimism, Uncle Shota a world of dark wit and wry sarcasm, as well as a logical disposition, and Aunt Emmy. She was the one who inadvertently made him want to laugh and love and live. Not that he'd ever tell her, she didn't need an even bigger ego or a swollen head. She was fun and silly and rash and everything Izuku should have avoided in a parental figure, but she was also incredibly smart and kind and loving, and it made him wish his own mother was still alive and with him. He was 10 already, and yet he only had his foster parents and sister with him. Kaori-sensei had stuck with her word, though. His ballet teacher taught him so much about trying to fend for himself. She helped him out whenever she could, with classes and braille, with self-defense, or even just listen to him rant about how stupid his day had been. But no matter how much Kaori-sensei or Aunt Emmy acted like it, they could never replace his parents. Izuku snuggled deeper into his bed, wrapping the sheets tightly around him. It had been 5 years to the day since his parents died, and he felt no desire to celebrate his 10th birthday. Even if it was a day and cause for celebration, he didn't ever want to celebrate his parents' death day, not even by proxy of celebrating his birthday. It had been this way for every birthday of his since his mother's and father's deaths. He couldn't bring himself to get up and enjoy growing a year older, it didn't feel right. Aunt Mika, Uncle Kyotoko and Kyo-chan had all tried to draw him out, but he refused to answer them, staying under the covers and remembering his parents. Most of his memories of them were mere fragments. He was too young to remember a lot about them before, but now he was older and they weren't here. Why did they have to go? Why did they have to leave him? No matter how much he wished they'd believe in him, or how much he wished they'd listen to him, they had always been there for him, but now they weren't. They were gone. Just gone. The Jiros and his uncles and Aunt Emmy made up for their departure, but not by much, and he still felt their absence every day. It didn't help that the kids at school somehow found out about his parents' death day falling on his birthday. That just gave them more ammunition. It was one of the reasons the Jiros allowed him to stay at home if his birthday ever fell on a school day. Izuku hated it, hated the lack of their presence in his life, the bullying and comments of him killing them, the guilt he felt and the pain it caused him. Izuku didn't express emotions often, but July 15th was the one day he almost always did. July 15th was the nothing day. Izuku drowned in the memories he had, the ones he could remember and the ones he wished he didn't. There, in his bedroom, buried under blankets on his bed, he wallowed in all the pain and sadness and grief and regret he trapped inside of himself, only to be pulled out of it all with 3 sharp raps on his bedroom door. Kyo-chan, Izuku murmured quietly, lifting his head out of the bundle he'd wrapped himself in to stare morosely at his door. It was his sister, he knew it was. Over the past 5 years, all the adults who'd cared for him had done their best, had tried to get Izuku to emerge from the blanket of sadness and guilt he buried himself in his room on Nothing Day, but no matter who it was, Izuku ignored everyone. Everyone except Jiro Kyoka, his one and only sister. After years of no response from him on Nothing Day, Aunt Mika and Uncle Kyotoko began to think that it was best they just left him alone, left him to his own devices on Nothing Day, but Kyo-chan disagreed and even to this very day worked to get Izuku out of his pit of despair. It wasn't really despair, Izuku knew what he was doing and just wanted to be alone on the one day of the year he hated the most. Kyo-chan didn't like that he hated his birthday and hated the fact he mourned his parents' death on Nothing Day instead of celebrating his birthday. What else could he do? It didn't feel right to throw a party, celebrate his life when his mom and dad didn't have theirs anymore. It was a fact that they were dead, pure and simple, and Izuku couldn't do anything about that, so he did the next best thing. Mourn them. He didn't like his birthday. He didn't really remember July 15th as Midoriya Izuku's birthday, but rather as the Nothing Day, Death Day, Mourning Day. He didn't want to remember it any other day. He snorted quietly to himself, even as the rapping on his door grew into thumping. Do I have to remember it any other way? He asked himself. Open up. Zu, I know you're in there, you're always in there on your birthday. Kyoka called. The thumping grew into banging as Kyoka grew impatient. Izuku sighed, sitting up in his bed. Go away, Kyo-chan, it's nothing day, he replied as he always did. Not today it isn't, she retorted, an air of finality in her stubborn tone of voice. I'm not leaving my room, no matter how much you want me to. Leave me alone, Kyo-chan, leave me alone on nothing day. That's the thing, you brainless bush, it's not nothing day. It's the 15th of July, the day my best friend and bitty brother Midoriya Izuku was born, don't you get that? Brainless bush, Izuku asked himself incredulously, and I'm not itty bitty, Kyo-chan. I may be a little short and yes, I'm younger than you, but only by 2 months, he grumbled. Quietly, he heard Kyoka snigger outside his door, before she sobered up and sighed in exasperation. Come on, Zu, is it really worth spending the entire time locked in your room? It's your birthday. It's also nothing day. I've told you before, Kyo-chan, I'm not celebrating the death of my parents. No matter how much I wished they'd believe in me, or at least not act as if I were fragile or a freak, I loved them and I know they loved me. And now they're gone. But that's exactly my point, you bush. Kyoka yelled, you're not celebrating the death of your parents, you're celebrating your life and the time you've spent living and being alive. It might be nothing day, or whatever to you, but to us, it's the birthday of our brother, son, nephew and student. Mom and Dad might have given up on getting you to come out, but I haven't. I know they leave your birthday presents outside your door, I've seen them to it, but I'm not. I won't. You're going to leave that stupid, bland bedroom of yours and come accept your gift from me and there's nothing you can do about it, Kyoka insisted and Izuku just knew she was scowling. You do realize there's plenty I can do about it, right? Like not coming out of my room, for instance. Izuku replied, quietly amused by the entire situation. Yes, he knew Aunt Mika and Uncle Kyotoko left presents for him outside his bedroom door. They had been doing so for longer than Kyoka knew. Izuku's birthday had always been one of the worst times of the year and he knew that. It wasn't often he had both parents to celebrate with at all. Sometimes Inko and Hisashi were both busy and they'd give him his 2 presents, one from each parent, and they'd run off to work, giving him a simple hug and a kiss, and then he'd be left at daycare, with the people he almost constantly disliked. But sometimes both Inko and Hisashi could celebrate with him. Sometimes they'd stay with him and take him on picnics and day trips together and it was like they were a real family. Before the sun would set and dawn would rise on a new day and both his parents would leave him at daycare and rush off to work again. The spell would be broken and Izuku was left wondering if they even saw him, truly knew that he was their son. He had never minded it much. They were busy, he understood, they still enrolled him in activities and classes, how could he complain? His parents were always doing things for him and that more often than not made up for them never being around, not really. It was one of the reasons he loved the Jiros, loved Aunt Mika as a mother, Uncle Kyotoko as a father and Kyo-chan as his dearest sister. They got along well, better than even Izuku thought they could, which was a bonus. It was rare for them to get into fights, but they had their moments, just like all siblings did. There was no parent in the world who actually expected all their children to get along perfectly without any arguments whatsoever, right? That would be impossible. Kyoka huffed and stamped her foot in annoyance. Damn it, Zu, now's not the time for technicalities, she yelled. Why don't you just give up with this? Izuku inquired snappishly. He had his reasons for doing what he did and, even if he was happy Kyoka never stopped trying, sometimes he wished she would leave him alone to mourn. Was that so hard to do? Because I don't want to spend another damn birthday of yours sitting at an empty table. Every year, Mom and Dad bake a cake and light candles, but you never come down. They used to wait downstairs for you to show yourself so that they could surprise you. They were devastated when you didn't come. They tried reaching out to you, persuading you, bribing you, but nothing ever worked. They just gave up, you know. Not on you. Never on one of their kids, but on the idea they'd ever celebrate your birthday with you. That was hard to watch. They still wrap your gifts and bake you a cake, but I'm the only one there, downstairs, waiting for you to show. I'm the only one at the table in the evening with the candles on the cake lit, and I'm the only one who tries to pull you out of your stupid blanket of misery so you can actually live and enjoy life, but you're as stubborn as a mule, Kyoka grumbled, wiping moisture away from her eyes. I know your parents are a complicated topic and I know you miss them, but you can't spend every damn birthday locked away in your room and pushing everyone else away because you're upset. People care about you, Izuku, but you don't seem to realize or care about that fact. It's been 5 years, Zu, you need to move on, she said quietly. Izuku could hear the pain and sadness in her voice. He knew she wanted him to be happy and safe and feel loved, but that wasn't something he could feel so easily. It wasn't that he didn't want to. Of course he did, he just couldn't. He'd never felt things as strongly as other kids did, never cared enough to make a fuss over things. When he grew up a little more, he began to think he was just mature, smarter, more logical than everyone else around him, but he soon learned that it could never be it. 2 years ago was when he realized why. He was full into the swing of training and he might have gotten a little carried away, which might have resulted in him growing overconfident in his ability over his quirk, which might have led him to start training sessions without an advisor watching over him. Those impromptu training sessions might have gone a little too well, which might have made him want to train more, so he might have started sneaking out of the house at night to train at a nearby park, which might have eventually led residents near the park and some heroes to believe a villain was attacking. That might have ended up with Izuku arrested for, not villainous activity, but illegal quirk usage, and the police might have called the Jiros, which might have resulted in serious scoldings. After they were done with him, they might have called up Uncle Shota, Uncle Hizashi and Aunt Emi, who might have given him their own tellings off, which might have earned him a 3-month house arrest, grounding and a 6-month ban from quirk training. He was still allowed to attend his other classes and lessons, but let's just say he slowed down considerably after that. Back then, the only thing Izuku cared about was getting as much practice with his quirk as he could, but that didn't lead to any mature decisions Izuku could recognize. Izuku was smart and certainly more level-headed than most kids his age, but maturity was not much present in his life. What he realized it was his own form of logic and rationality, and, granted his stunt with his training wasn't very logical, it was still rooted in a pathway of thoughts Izuku had believed to make sense. Zu, are you so caught up about your parents you hate your birthday? Kyoka asked quietly. Izuku sighed and shook his head, responding verbally after he realized Kyoka couldn't see him. I don't hate my birthday, Kyo-chan, I don't think I could if I tried. It's just, Mom and Dad were only ever rarely there for me on my birthday. They were either called in at the last minute or they had to take a shift, or they'd already made plans. I just thought they were busy. That was a better thought than, Mom and Dad can never make time for me. I don't express my emotions a lot, you know that, right? Yeah, we love trash-talking the other kids because they're scared of that part about you, Kyoka responded quickly. I can still feel emotions. I think I'd be a zombie without them, but it's like they've been muted, toned down, so I don't feel the as strongly as others do. But whenever I start thinking about my birthday, the day my parents used to leave me alone at home or at daycare, and then the day when they died. It's like every one of my emotions starts trying to burst through my chest, and I hate it, because I don't understand what I'm feeling, never had to put a name to an emotion before, he snorted quietly, his tone bitter, scared and grieving all at once. Kyoka was quiet for a while after that. She was never so quiet for so long, and Izuku had almost started to believe she'd left, if it weren't for the outline of a tiny human outside his door. Izuku, do you want to leave your room and celebrate with us? She asked eventually. Izuku paused, thought about the question and finally nodded. He did want to celebrate with his uncles, aunt and the Jiros. He did want to see them, want to hear their voices, but the nameless emotions always threatened to burst out whenever he left the room, and so he never did. He told his sister as much and he saw her outline nod. You have your violin with you, don't you? She asked again, rather abruptly this time. Izuku raised a quizzical eyebrow, but replied with an affirmative. Pack it into its case and follow me, I think I know how to help, was her final instruction. Completely perplexed and bewildered at this point, it was all Izuku could do just to follow her instructions, taking a deep breath and opening the door to his room quicker than his thoughts could persuade him not to. Jiro's smiling outline greeted him, and inside his heart he started to feel as if he'd made the right choice, violin case clenched tightly in hand. Izuku followed his sister down the hallway and up a set of discolored, dusty stairs that seemed to creak with every step. He didn't have much problem following her, what with the amount of plants the Jiros had bought. It was a year after he had been taken in by the Jiros and had begun quirk training with the 3 pro heroes that he started to understand his quirk. One of those understandings was the fact that all his enhanced and increased senses, and his ability to see outlines of people and objects, relied on the amount of earth, plants or soil nearby. He also discovered that the type of earth he could manipulate relied on one's understanding of what earth is. Izuku, since he was learning the art of earthbending from Toph, or the earth's memories of the master earthbender, classified earth as the ground beneath his feet. He believed it to be soil and dirt, but conceded the fact that plants and trees and flowers, anything that grew from the earth, excluding what you could eat, like veggies, were also often classified under the term earth. What this meant for Izuku was that his senses increased, his ability to see outlines of people, places and objects, feel, hear and smell, by the amount of houseplants, soil, dirt or even trees or flowers were near him or his immediate location, even though he could only manipulate the ground, soil, not trees or plants. It was weird and complicated and illogical, but Uncle Shota was always talking about how quirks were weird and complicated and illogical to begin with. Once he'd told Uncle Kyotoko and Aunt Mika this, the 2 adults had gone and layered their house with little plants and flowers, so Izuku's ability to see was always sharp. "This is us," Kyoka snapped Izuku out of his thoughts again, startled to see an empty expanse of white cloud and mist right where the edge of the house's outline ended. "Are we on the roof?" he asked, somewhat incredulously. He'd raised an eyebrow at her. She knew their parentals didn't like it when she took him somewhere he couldn't return from easily, and the roof had always been a banned zone, even if Kyoka had been there by herself. "Yup. And not a word about how Mom and Dad hate it when I go up here. That also means no pointing out the fact that me bringing you here is a probably terrible idea," Kyoka rattled off calmly. Izuku sighed and shook his head at her. "Okay, fine, but if Aunt Mika and Uncle Kyotoko asked, I never knew we'd be going someplace they'd banned us from." "Oh, don't worry, you had no choice in the matter. Here, repeat after me. I have no choice in the matter," she droned, her smile growing sharp and cheeky. Izuku sighed again. "I have no choice in the matter," he said wearily. "Now will you tell me why we're here, and why me bringing my violin was a good idea?" "Okay, it's a little past dawn, but it's still early enough in the morning that the sun shouldn't have reached its peak yet." "Kyo-chan, it's only 10:12, Izuku deadpanned, his head turning to face her. As far as he knew, they were both facing the sun, their backs to the house mostly behind them, but Izuku was now looking at Kyoka, and as much as she loved her brother, she still found it a little unsettling to have a blind boy know exactly where she was. "Whenever I have too many emotions, too many things I want to feel, to say, Mom and Dad tell me I should play one of my instruments, or sing, to get out everything I feel, because sometimes you feel too much, you can't put it in words. You brought me up here to play out my feelings because there aren't enough words to express my emotions?" Izuku questioned skeptically. Kyoka gave him a flat look and Izuku sighed, kneeling down to unstrap his violin from its case. "Just so you know, if this doesn't work, you're taking the blame for why we're up here when the parentals banned us from being up here," Izuku grumbled, before taking up his bow, set his violin in position and bow on strings and drew out the first note of a melody he'd played 100 times over. It was by no means a simple song. It was long and filled with processions of short notes in quick order, followed by several long, drawn-out notes to produce a sharp, sad song filled with all the emotion Izuku had poured into it. His unseeing eyes closed as a light smile crossed his face. Kyoka watched him with a smile of her own. The stunning music played without a pause, stutter or mistake, played almost as if it were second nature. The music was loud and sweet and sad, and she doubted Izuku even felt the tears running down his cheeks. He played with all his heart, the sharp, sweet and depressing melody under the streaming morning sunlight, though she didn't account for how loud the playing would be, and the crowd forming on the pavements outside their house was definitely going to signal to her parents, if the playing wasn't signal enough. Eventually, Izuku played the final note, letting it draw out and hang in the crisp air, and all was silent, for half a second. "Play it again. Dude, that was epic. Can you play an Attack on Titan theme song? Do Bluebird. Mommy, can he play for my birthday party? Midoriya Izuku and Jiro Kyoka. What are you two doing on the roof?" came Mika's annoyed voice. The two children yelped, scrambling to get down from the roof, much to the amusement and disappointment of the rather sizable crowd they'd managed to gather. They made it down from the roof, into the dusty attic, down the creaky wooden steps to stop in front of Mika and Kyoto. Neither adult looked happy. "What have we told you about climbing onto the roof?" Mika asked them both, frowning at them as only a disappointed parent would. "I told you we'd get in trouble," Izuku hissed at his sister. "Izu, if you knew that, why did you follow Kyoka?" Kyoto asked with a sigh. The most he could offer to that question was a shrug of his shoulders, something neither parent appreciated. "Could you at least tell us what you were doing up there?" Mika relented, herding the children to the couches in the living room of the first floor. "Zu said he had too many emotions and that words were stupid, so I told him to play, and the best place for him to do that was the roof," Kyoka muttered, slumping on an armchair guiltily. Kyoto and Mika looked at Izuku, who nodded sheepishly. Mika sighed deeply, massaging her forehead with a hand in exasperation. "Even so, please warn us the next time you try that. Guys, you scared us," Kyoto replied for Mika. "In any case, happy birthday, Izu. We've been waiting to say that for 5 years," the man grinned, reaching over to Izuku from where he sat and ruffled his hair fondly. Izuku gave a shy smile. Kyoka had been right, as much as he hated to admit it. The emotions that had bogged him down before felt like they'd just evaporated into thin air. For the first time in 5 years, Izuku felt like he could really, truly enjoy Nothing Day. Chapter text. 2 weeks after Nothing Day, or rather, his birthday, Izuku found his life slowly but surely changing around him. The first of those changes actually began on Nothing Day, his first real celebration of his birthday with the Jiros and Uncle Shota, Uncle Zashi and Aunt Emmy, the latter two of which smothered him in hugs and presents. His previously gray and mostly dull-colored room, seeing as Izuku couldn't see colors, he didn't really care what his room looked like, was now bursting with reds, greens, purples, yellows, dark grays and deep turquoise, alongside the silvers, golds and browns of his numerous instruments. Izuku had asked what the point of having a colorful room was when you couldn't see color, but Uncle Sho had just told him to let Aunt Emmy and Uncle Zashi work, because they couldn't be dissuaded, apparently. That was another change in his life. Uncle Shota had become Uncle Sho, and Izuku loved it. The three heroes had only grown closer to Izuku after he showed for his birthday celebration, with Aunt Emmy especially. She had gradually started leaving Uncle Sho alone to pester Izuku instead, and though he thought she was annoying as heck, Izuku had to admit, if he expressed emotions as one normally did, she would have gotten him long ago. As it was, all the smile hero received from him was a bland stare and a raised eyebrow. She never stopped trying though, and an every couple of days visit turned into a once every 2 days visit. There was more, though, that happened in the last 2 weeks. For one, Izuku had found a friend, Kyoka too, but they fought like cats and dogs. Izuku had also, amazingly enough, had started to earn some money not from the Jiros, the 3 pro heroes or Kaori-sensei. It turned out, playing a not-beginner violin song practically perfectly on the top of his house for all the street to hear was a brilliant way to be hired by people who wanted entertainment for parties and other events. It started with one comment from one little girl, and suddenly their family was contacting the Jiros in hopes of hiring Izuku as a party entertainer. After that hit, and Izuku showing off a few of the many instruments he could play, one family after the next asked him to perform at their kids' or relatives' parties. That number of people, interestingly enough, increased somewhat once people learned about Izuku's blindness. One of the events Izuku was hired to play at was as an accompanist to a drama club's play at one of the public elementary schools near where the Jiros lived. Later, Izuku found out the club had to beg their advisor to allow this and that it was the club's advisor who'd contacted the Jiros, but that was where, out of all the places, Izuku and Kyoka found their first friend outside of each other. It was bright, sunny, it was storming, actually. Nah, it was sunny. The day started off brilliantly, and after roughly a week of practicing the songs the club wanted him to play, Izuku was dragging Kyoka around the house as he rushed to finish preparing for the play that afternoon. She was getting sick of it, after a few hours, and smacked him over the head to get him to calm down. "You've been preparing for this stupid play ever since those kids asked you to play in their play last week," she snapped, dragging him to the couch and forcing him to drop his backpack full of notebooks, sheet music and his pencil case and carefully deposit his violin case on the ground by his feet. Izuku pouted, but did as she ordered anyway, sinking into the couch by her side. "I can't help it, Kyo-chan, I've never done something like this before." "You've performed in front of a crowd, though, why's this any different?" she questioned, confused. "Yeah, but I'm usually the main attraction. This time, I need to coordinate with the drama club. We've never even tried this before, which is rather silly, to be honest, but I've memorized my cues and when I need to enter and exit in the script, but I hope this goes well," he confessed. "You'll do fine, Izuku. You've been playing those songs like a madman, non-stop, since you got the sheet music. You've done all you can. Now you have to trust the drama geeks to get it right. They asked for this, after all," Kyoka told him. "Besides, isn't that why we're arriving at Musudafu Elementary early, to practice timing with the club?" They talked and tried, laughing to distract Izuku from the slowly advancing time, until Mika and Kyotoko finally announced it was time to leave. Izuku was up, out of the house and in the car faster than the Jiros could walk out the front door and, in his haste, almost left his violin in the house. Kyoka wouldn't leave him alone after that stunt. She wouldn't forget either, if Izuku knew her at all. It felt like the drive was agonizingly slow, to Izuku, but it was in no time at all that they arrived at the school and showed to the gym by a young man with spiked silver hair and a slightly shiny sheen to his skin. His eyes were watery blue and he was dressed in a loose checkered shirt tucked into fading blue jeans. "Are you sure he's a teacher?" Kyoka asked incredulously, and loudly. "More of an advisor for the clubs, but I am a teaching assistant for Meihara-sensei," he grinned. Izuku elbowed Kyoka in the ribs to get her to be quiet, but she only glared at him in return and continued asking her questions. The man answered them all smoothly, as if he'd answered them 100 times before. In hindsight, he probably had, seeing as he was an elementary school assistant teacher. Kids were curious, Izuku knew, he himself having been hounded by the kids he entertained at birthday parties about himself and his quirk. The man, Izuku had to ask for his name, this was getting ridiculous, led them around the school until they arrived at the gym where the kids in the club were to perform in. It was a Saturday, which meant most of the other kids were still in morning classes and the play would begin about a half hour after classes ended to give parents and guardians time to arrive and make their way over to the gym. The drama kids had been excused from class to set up and prepare the stage for the play. It also meant Izuku and Kyoka were pulled from class to help out. The gym, when they entered, was full of mostly colored props and sewn costumes. The play the club was supposed to be putting on was a sort of Robin Hood meets Little Red Riding Hood thing, in which Little Red is devoured by the wolf, but instead of a woodcutter saving her, Robin Hood did. He and his merry men heard the commotion as they were fleeing through the forest from the Sheriff of Nottingham and saves Little Red. Bonding over their love of cloaks, albeit with different colors, Little Red joins Robin and becomes a thief and a merry man, eventually becoming Robin Hood's second in command and takes over leading them once Robin dies. She becomes known as Red Hood, in honor of Robin Hood, and rescues the people of England from King John's reign as Robin Hood once wished to do. It was interesting enough and the combat scenes were well scripted, but Izuku guessed they needed something extra to make it perfect, which was where he and his violin came in. Loud, Fast-paced and energetically tense music for combat and action scenes, and slow, quiet, sad music for scenes like Robin Hood's death and funeral. The man, who'd finally introduced himself as Miyakura Ioto, weaved and wound them through the props and costumes to where children, who looked to range anywhere from 8 to 12 years old, sat near, around and on stage. Several appeared to be rereading through the script and others acting on the stage. Meanwhile more were in the background, arranging scenery props and laying items like swords, flowers, arrows and even a couple bottles of fake blood around the wings of the stage and on the stage itself. "Garaisawa, the musician's here," Iota called out. All at once, any and every action around and on the stage halted, eyes flickering over to Izuku and the Jiros. "At last, we have been awaiting your arrival," cried a slightly tall girl with glowing ginger hair gathered in a ponytail high on her head. She was dressed in an unusual set of hose, breeches and tunic underneath a bright crimson cloak, the hood down. A plastic quiver of fake plastic arrows was looped over one shoulder and opposite hip. She leapt nimbly from the stage and rushed over to where Izuku and Kyoka stood, Mika and Kyotoko a few paces behind them. Her eyes shone with delight as she positively beamed at them. "It is fate that you should be here today. After all, when we saw you performing at Yosei's party like a natural, I made the expert decision to hire you on. Our showcase of talent shan't be complete without your playing," she babbled with an eager grin. Izuku was unfazed, having faced down both Uncle Zashi and Aunt Emmy at the same time before in Won, but Kyoka backed up a little, squinting at the energy the girl seemed to give off. "Introductions, Garaisawa, then straight into rehearsals. We don't have much time before the people start arriving and the gym has to be cleared of all this before then," Iota reminded her. Quick as a flash, Garaisawa straightened up, completely unbothered with her enthusiasm. "Right, I am the brilliant and fearless Garaisawa Yuika, president of the dramatic, enthusiastic, completely bombastic drama and theater club, and the peasants behind me are but my minions in the cause of reigning a performance meant to delight on our poor, unsuspecting audience." She posed dramatically and spoke without pause as the rest of the kids in the club groaned and rolled their eyes. One blond boy snickered quietly to himself. Izuku's eyes landed on him and stayed there. He stepped forwards not long after, bowing with a flourish and an elegance unexpected for a kid, a boy, no less, Izuku's and Kyoka's age. "It is a pleasure to meet a jungler such as yourself, and that you would give us aid in the form of your talents in our dark times is a fact we shall strive to repay. I am Monoma Nito, my dear Lady Yuika's second in command and fellow lover of drama," he said. Kyoka backed up a little more, while Izuku merely sighed. He glanced sightlessly at the outlines of the other kids, again rolling their eyes at Monoma's bold statement. "Will they listen if I introduce myself normally, or?" He left the question hanging. A few of the other kids managed grins and Izuku heard a few snorts around the stage. Outside of the theater and stage, yeah they would, but in here, everyone has to speak like they live in the pre-Quirk olden days or neither Monoma-kun or Yuika-san will listen, someone helpfully pointed out. Izuku sighed again, already wishing he was somewhere else. "This is a waste of time, you know that, right?" he called out. "Then you better get on with it," another kid yelled back. Izuku had no doubt they were all smiling. "Greetings to thee, my Lady Yuika, and you, Lord Nito. It is my pleasure to offer you and your party of entertainers of the arts and my services. You may call me Midoriya Izuku, simple jungler and musician of the old instruments. The good lady behind me is my dearest sister, Jiro Kyoka, and with her are her sir and madam, my aunt, Lady Mika, and my uncle, the good Lord Kyotoko. Might I request we commence the rehearsal to what, I have no doubt, will be a stunning masterpiece." He rattled off smoothly. The drama and theater club kids had fallen silent completely, by this point, and Izuku was absolutely sure all eyes were once again on him, but he supposed if Monoma's were too, he didn't mind as much. Even the unshakable Garaisawa seemed to have frozen slightly, which Kyoka took no pause in reporting to Izuku. Behind him, he was sure Mika and Kyotoko were grinning widely at him, before their attention was captured. "All right, the main introductions have been completed. The rest of you introduce yourselves to Midoriya in your free time. We have a show to put on, let's move it, people." Ioto scattered them like ninepins as the kids rushed to tidy up the gym space and position themselves for the first rehearsals beginning. It did not go well. Because Izuku was to be a part of the play, essentially, he was made to put on a costume of his own, and while Izuku was fine with it, the costume inevitably looked like a dress instead of the grass green, flowing outfit and veil it was supposed to be. And who knew trying to figure out timing and entrance and exit cues would be difficult with only outlines as his basis. As such, not only was his timing off, but the actors kept getting confused and forgetting their lines, stumbling over each other and generally making a mess out of the play while Kyoka sat with Mika and Kyotoko on a fold-up chair laughing at the failure that was the play rehearsal. Not usually one to get wound up, Izuku found himself promising revenge on Kyoka when they finished with the play. Thankfully, though, they still had about an hour and a half until morning classes finished and slightly longer than that to start making their way into the gym. After several more rehearsals, the play came together and flowed without many mistakes at all. Kyoka fell silent sometime during the third rehearsal and was enraptured by the time they had to start getting ready for the live performance. It made Izuku want to smirk, but he didn't, because he knew Kyoka believed it would work out the entire time. Ioto and the club soon got to work, setting out fold-up chairs and mats at the front for their audience, tidying up the stage before the very first audience members started arriving. It wasn't long after that the gym was filled and the play ready to begin, the actors too. None of them had any idea Izuku was there at all. In fact, he had been hidden away at his choice, not wanting to be known to the audience to keep the magic of the story alive. The play began with violin music so quiet the audience couldn't hear it, but as Izuku grew the sound and the curtains lifted and lights brightened that the audience fell excitedly silent, anticipating the reveal of the musician. Except that didn't happen, and the story opened with Garisawa as Little Red Riding Hood being eaten by a younger member of the club, which the audience found hilarious. A small, tiny boy pretending to eat a girl almost a head taller than himself, comedy gold. The story progressed brilliantly, from vibrant, fast-paced action scenes to the softer, more emotional bonding moments between Robin and Little Red, Garisawa's character's name up until she assumed the name, Red Hood, at Robin's death. Monoma, fascinatingly enough, was chosen to play Robin Hood, and although Izuku couldn't enjoy the play to its fullest, the way Monoma played the role made Izuku want to follow the story just as closely as the audience did, but he had his own job, he reminded himself, pulling a sharp, distinct high note from his violin and plunged automatically into the last battle scene between the Sheriff of Nottingham, Robin Hood, and Little Red and the merry men before Robin's tragic death. The audience was caught between curiosity and intrigue, the mystery violinist's music always present, yet not a sign of them at all. The play drew to a glorious end with the freedom of the people of England and Red Hood being laid to rest near Robin Hood as her duties as the leader of the merry men and Robin's wishes were finally complete. The aftermath of Izuku's decision to stay hidden was not properly thought out, he realized, as all exits to the gym were blocked off by the crowd demanding to know who he was. "You seem to be stuck, Midoriya," Monoma grinned at him. Izuku shot him an annoyed sideways glance, but the boy only laughed lowly. "I just a joke, but you are stuck. You don't want to be discovered and they want to know who you are. My, what a pickle," he teased. "Do you have to do this now?" Izuku asked him, irritated. Monoma danced around Izuku, who closed the door that led from the changing rooms behind the stage to the gym harshly. The boy seemed full of humor and cheekiness, because his teasing of Izuku didn't end there. "Now, if only you knew of someone so kind and helpful, who knew the school and could get you out of here without being seen by the crowd, what would you do for that?" Monoma laughed, smirking annoyingly at Izuku. The blind boy sighed, eyeing Monoma. "You can help, for a price. I want your phone number." "Why?" Izuku asked, now thoroughly confused. Monoma paused, frowning at Izuku. "Obviously I'd want my new friend's number," he replied. "Oh, didn't know that. Are we friends?" "I just met you," Izuku told him. For all of his knowledge of pretty much anything logical, he was inept at reading social cues and interacting with people who didn't automatically hate him. Monoma must have picked that up, because the wide, teasing grin slowly replaced the frown on his face and he clapped a hand on Izuku's shoulder. "Not to worry, my new friend. I shall teach you everything you need to know, then we shall prove our superiority over the society that holds us back, ha 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 ha. Monoma laughed. Why would we need to do that? The question from Izuku made Monoma pause in his demonic laughter. Make people eat their words. The answer came out as more of a question. Let them laugh, they'll be eating their words when we become heroes, Izuku snorted. Trust me when I tell you people will only listen to what they want to hear. You need to force people to listen, make them see they were wrong. Win in silence until then and make them think we're losing, he said. How did you know I want to be a hero? Monoma asked, startled. Every kid our age wants to become a hero. It's all they think about. I'm no different, but I, at least, have been working towards that goal. I see, interesting. Come with me for now, you don't want to be spotted, right? There's a back door behind the stage in one of the wings, people use it all the time to get out of here unseen, Monoma told him. Izuku nodded and they traded numbers, then ran off in search of the door. After a successful exit, Izuku met up with the Jiros and they left the school, Mika declaring they'd eat out to celebrate a job well done. They'd let Izuku pick the restaurant, but were uncertain how to progress with his silence otherwise. The car ride to their eating spot was mostly quiet, with a few murmurs of conversation from Aunt Mika and Uncle Kyotoko. Until Izuku's voice spoke up softly from the back of the car. I think I made a friend today, he remarked, and the car fell silent completely. What? Kyoka screeched, spinning around in her seat, her eyes bulging as she gawked at him. Monoma, he cornered me in the changing rooms backstage when the audience accidentally trapped me in, bribed me for my number in return for a safe exit and promptly declared us friends. He's like Uncle Zashi, except more cynical and sly, Izuku explained simply. Whoa, Kyoka breathed, a grin playing on her lips. You get the attention of everyone, don't you? It's not like I planned for that to happen, you know. It's not my fault I'm socially incompetent and most of our conversation flew over my head, he protested mildly, not even panic crossing his blank face. But that guy, seriously, Kyoka exclaimed. Izuku nodded. Somehow, I made a friend. I even gave him my cell number. Izuku paused, then cocked his head to one side, curiously. I wonder how a blind person texts, anyway. Really, Zu, there's such a thing as voice messages, Kyoka groaned with exasperation. Izuku shot her a bland look, one eyebrow raised in calm question. And you, someone as socially inept as I am and who has just as many friends as I do can relate. Kyoka flushed, scowling. Okay, so she didn't have any friends, or a real need to text, but she knew how cell phones worked, stupid foster brother. Fine, I'll accept him, but I want to meet him first, Kyoka declared. If he plans on hurting my brother at all, he's getting jacked in the face, she added silently in her thoughts. She raised her earphone jacks threateningly and Izuku sighed, already guessing at what was passing through her head. Mika and Kyotoko merely grinned at each other, before telling Izuku and Kyoka to shelve the conversation for later. They had a filling lunch at a cozy little restaurant near their house, then headed home. There, Izuku managed to ask Monoma for his parents' numbers, so Mika, because she didn't trust Kyotoko to not harass the family, could set up a meeting between Izuku, Kyoka and Monoma. It went about as well as expected. Midoriya, good to see you, my friend, on this day. Monoma cried as he and his parents were led into the Jiro's living room. It's good to see you, too, Monoma, Izuku replied. From her place at Izuku's side, Kyoka glared at Monoma suspiciously. Her brother was amazing, kind and strong. He was her best friend and no dramatic, loud blonde was going to take him away from her, not if she could help it. I hope you remember my sister, Jiro Kyoka, Izuku asked almost hopefully. Right, the one who came with you to our performance, Monoma's face scrunched up slightly. Izuku prayed Kyoka didn't take offense at that. Kyoka took offense. And I remember you too. Blackmail's low for the vice president of a drama club, she sneered. Behave, Kyo-chan, Izuku whispered into her ear resignedly. I don't trust him, Zu, Kyoka hissed back, glaring at Monoma. Izuku sighed, then turned to his guardians. We'll be in my room if you need us, but if you hear yelling, it's safe to say Kyo-chan attacked Monoma, he said, deadpan. Monoma's parents looked slightly miffed at his sentence, but Mika and Kyotoko nodded their understanding, even if they had to hide smiles behind hands. As Izuku, Monoma and Kyoko left for the stairs, Mika and Kyotoko turned to Monoma's parents. Sorry about our daughter. She's fiercely protective of Izuku. A lot of other kids don't exactly like the two, so they're practically the only friends they have. Nito-kun's sudden announcement of friendship between him and Kyoko didn't go over so well. Mika apologized with a sheepish smile. It's all right. We understand Nito can come off as a little strange, but he does genuinely want to be friends with Izuku-kun. I'm not sure about Kyoka-chan, though. I think he sees her as a sort of rival, Monoma's mother replied with a laugh of her own. I'm Monoma Hibiki and this is my husband, Monoma Arai. It's nice to meet you officially. Hibiki smiled, bowing to Mika and Kyotoko. Arai nodded with a bow of his own. Well then, now that we've got that sorted, why don't we continue this chat over some tea and snacks? The kids might be up there a while, Kyotoko grinned, gesturing towards the kitchen. That sounds lovely, thank you for the invitation, Arai replied, flashing a small smile of his own. Monoma Hibiki was a petite woman, slim and slender and oh so short compared to her mammoth of a husband. They both had the same twinkling blue eyes, but Hibiki's hair was a pale blonde and Arai's a very light blue. The conversation between the four adults proceeded amicably. Arai, the quiet giant he was, chimed in every once in a while, but no more than a few words or so, content to let Hibiki do the talking. Kyotoko and Mika took turns speaking and all of them thought highly of the other set of parents, thankfully. Hibiki and Arai agreed the Jiros were friendly, kind people who wouldn't turn out to be quirkist and the Jiros thought the Monomas were interesting and good people who wouldn't turn out to be ableist. Each set of parents' thoughts only solidified when footsteps could be heard descending the stairs and Izuku walked into the kitchen with his usual blank expression. Izuku, what's going on? Shouldn't you be upstairs with Kyo and Nito-kun? Mika asked in confusion. Izuku merely shrugged. They kicked me out. Said they wanted to talk to each other alone, so I'm making myself useful and getting us some tea and snacks. By the way, Nito showed me his quirk. Izuku turned to Hibiki and Arai, who stiffened ever so slightly. Was their boy's new friend quirkist? He's got one of the coolest quirks I've ever seen. He can copy my quirk without any of my side effects, even if it's on a weaker scale. He can copy my quirk. Izuku turned to the Jiros. And still see. Coolest quirk ever, he said without hesitance. Mika's and Kyotoko's eyes widened. This was perhaps the most emotion Izuku had bothered to show to someone he didn't know all that well in first names already. That boy was a definite keeper. Wait, what do you mean, he can copy my quirk and still see? Hibiki questioned, her eyebrows scrunched together in confusion. Arise did the same, then his expression cleared as if he realized the answer. He turned to Izuku, whose face became guarded at the unintentional slip-up. I believe this makes your parents' explanation a little clearer. Little Nito's had to face the same problem, except over his quirk. I'm sure he appreciated the positive reaction, he said quietly. Izuku nodded, relaxing again. He did, just as I appreciated the lack of reaction from him over my eyes. What do you mean, oh. That explains why he warmed up to you so fast, Hibiki grimaced. Both sets of parents turned to each other and grinned happily. Discrimination beeps, Mika snorted. It does indeed, Hibiki laughed. I think that much is clear, Izuku said mildly. He glanced up at the roof, pausing in his activities in the kitchen. Do you think they'll damage my instruments in their argument? If they do, it's coming out of their allowance, Mika and Hibiki chimed together. Those two will be in debt for years, Kyotoko and Arai muttered to themselves, clutching their heads sadly. Izuku nodded wisely and kept quiet, wondering if this was the beginning of having two sets of the same parents. He glanced up at the ceiling again, and seeing everything was quiet, shrugged and returned to his duties. He'd been asked to remain downstairs for the time being and not be present for their conversation, in that many words and less. Monoma was polite. His sister, on the other hand, not so much. Me and Mr. Dramatic over their need to talk. Go downstairs and no checking on us with your time-damned overpowered quirk, understand? She demanded. Izuku didn't have a problem with it, so he left them alone. In his room, with his precious instruments. All of them. Izuku sighed. He was going to regret this, wasn't he? Jiro Kyoka, Monoma Nito thought, was possibly the best sister his first, and only, Monoma was in denial, friend could have ever had. He could see it in the way she stood, straight-backed, defiant, glaring at him, and in the way she spoke of him. To be honest, when they requested demanded privacy from Izuku so they could talk, he hadn't really expected her stout questioning in defense of her brother. What made it even more admirable was that the two weren't biological siblings in the slightest. He'd learned a lot from Izuku about the green-haired boy's situation over texts and the odd call. Kyoka and her parents were just his music teachers before Izuku's parents died in 2 separate car accidents on the same day. Really, what were the odds? If that wasn't suspicious, he didn't know what was. They took him in only so Izuku didn't have to go into foster care, and even then, Kyoka didn't have to see him as a brother at all, but she did. Izuku was her brother and Kyoka Izuku's sister. Their dynamic intrigued him greatly. Izuku was usually calm, organized, unable to be flustered under most circumstances. He kept a level head and a blank face. Izuku had said he really didn't understand emotions all that well, and it had been that way since he was a kid. Kyoka, on the other hand, was a revolving door of expressions and emotions. She wore her heart on her sleeve and her thoughts on her face. She was smart and full of sarcastic retorts and snarky replies. She was a wall of stone on the outside and a marshmallow inside. For all her love of rock and dark clothes and lighting, Izuku had told him of her love of sprinkles and plushies, of the soul and emotion she poured into her singing and the love she exuded when she looked at or played one of her own collection of instruments. Monoma stared at her, his bright blue eyes sharp and his smirk dangerous, taunting. Kyoka's scowl deepened and Monoma knew he'd pissed her off. Zu's gone now, and he doesn't break his word unless it's for the greater good, so spill. What do you want with my brother? She practically growled. Monoma raised an eyebrow. You don't have many friends, do you? He asked bluntly. Kyoka flushed red, glaring at him and then jabbing one of her jacks into his side. Monoma yelped, pulling away from her. Now it was his turn to glare. That was uncalled for, and you didn't answer the question. What do you want with my brother? I want to be his friend. Harmony knows he needs one. He muttered the last part to himself, but Kyoka's earphone jacks didn't only grant her instant wireless headphones, it also gave her enhanced hearing she couldn't exactly turn off. It was the gift and curse of mutant quirks. Harmony. And he has me. I should be enough. Kyoka glared at him. Monoma sighed patronizingly, shaking his head and trying hard not to laugh. Jiro, you can't be Midoriya's only friend forever. That won't work and it won't happen. Believe me when I say that apparently not everyone our age is the equivalent of human garbage. Kyoka gave a snort of amusement before she could stop herself and her eyes widened. She narrowed her eyes at Monoma. So you're not out to bully or hurt Izuku? Of course not. I want to be his friend because he needs one just as much as I do, and Monoma's eyes fell softly on Kyoka. I think you might need one, too. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.